Thank you. And I'm like, the thing is, I'm figuring out the and it's definitely thinking of 70.
Are you waiting for a spot?
Yeah, because during the session.
Oh, yeah. So I'm the.
Yeah. Oh, really?
But you want this plastic too?
Yeah. It's a meeting.
Michael, you don't.
Sorry. I like to recycle.
So.
All right. All right. We are back after a lunch break. When we broke, Dr. Anderson had just had questioning completed by NEE. So now we turn to petitioner Wild Earth Guardians. Mr. Davis. Okay. She said she was done with her questioning. So, Mr. Davis, do you have questions of Dr. Anderson?
I do. Oh, thanks. Hello, Dr. Anderson. I'm Tim Davis. I represent the petitioner Wild Earth Guardians.
Hello.
I looked over your CV and I just want to confirm that you are not a chemist.
Correct.
Do you mind if I ask you one more chemistry question today?
I can try.
I believe that you testified earlier today about the breakdown of PFAS. Do you recall that?
Correct.
Is it your testimony that when PFAS breaks down, that the carbon fluorine bonds break?
Okay, so if you're asking all PFAS and any carbon fluorine bond, that's too broad. The carbon fluorine bond, from what I understand, is extremely difficult to break. But we do see some breakage under different scenarios of that carbon fluorine bond. Depends on where the carbon is, depends on the fluorination state, and you'd have to ask a chemist and somebody special in fate and transport. It can happen, yes.
And when you say it can happen, is that breakdown in the natural environment?
Can you clarify your question for me, please?
I'm just going to object as I don't know that she was testifying about. I'll strike that and I'll listen to the line of questioning.
I heard,
Go ahead.
yeah, I heard her testify about degradation. So
Yeah,
go ahead.
Go ahead. I'll listen to the line of questioning.
Yeah, my question is, I believe you just stated that the carbon fluorine bond can break under certain circumstances. And my question about that is whether the carbon fluorine bond can break when it's degradation in the natural environment.
From what I understand is that's still a pretty active area of research, and you'd have to ask somebody who's studying that in-depthly to get the nuance.
Would you suggest I ask a chemist?
Or someone who's working in the fate and transport of those PFAS.
Would you agree that the perfluorinated component of an original PFAS compound that breaks down remains? So the perfluorinated component remains perfluorinated after breakdown.
I believe it depends.
What does it depend on?
The molecule you're talking about, the conditions under which the chemical is exposed and sitting.
Could you give me an example of when a perfluorinated component would break down?
Not with a lot of detail, but I have seen the degradation pathways of some of the polyfluorinated, and you do get smaller pieces, you get chunks. Again, you'll have to ask somebody with that kind of chemistry experience to talk about the dissociation energy between those different bonds.
Those smaller pieces that remain, are they sometimes perfluorinated?
What do you, could you rephrase? What do you mean by?
Sure. You said that when they break down, some smaller pieces remain. Those smaller pieces would have a carbon fluorine bond?
Depends where on the molecule, but could, yes.
In page 7 of your direct testimony, you state that PFAS should be more specifically enumerated and must delineate between PFAS for which there is toxicology data and potential concerns for human health risks, and those PFAS for which no such data or concerns exist. Statements regarding potential human or environmental risk must be limited to the compounds for which data are available to inform what exposure levels may be present, an unacceptable increase in risk on a chemical specific nature. Is that an accurate reading of your testimony?
I don't have it in front of me, but it sounds good.
For PFAS for which no toxicological data exists, does that mean they're not toxic?
Could you repeat your question?
Sure. Do you agree that there's many PFAS for which no toxicological data exists?
There are some, yes.
For those PFAS for which we have no toxicological data, does that mean that they're not toxic?
No.
On page 14 of your direct, you state that proper public risk communication regarding chemicals potentially present in the environment is essential to avoid, quote, chemophobia, which is known to result in a decrease in public health and other social and economic adverse effects. Do you recall that?
Again, I don't have a copy in front of me, but it sounds accurate, yes.
Are chemicals already being disclosed in New Mexico oil and gas operations?
To the extent that I'm aware of the disclosure in FRAC Focus, that's all I can answer.
Are you aware of any clinically diagnosed and treated, strike that. Are you aware of anyone who has been clinically diagnosed and treated for chemophobia in the United States?
Can you ask the question again, please?
Are you aware of any person who has been clinically treated and diagnosed for chemophobia in the United States?
I'm not sure that chemophobia is a treatable disease.
Chemophobia is a disease?
Could you rephrase your question? I was trying to use your words. I apologize.
Sure. Are you aware of any person who has ever been clinically diagnosed and treated for chemophobia in the United States?
I don't think that that's a possible thing.
Is chemophobia a disease?
I don't believe so.
You agree that some chemicals are already being disclosed in New Mexico?
I believe what I just answered is only to the extent of what is in FRAC Focus, is my understanding.
It's fair to call that partial disclosure of chemicals?
I don't know.
Is the disclosure of chemicals in New Mexico currently causing chemophobia?
I do not know.
Are you familiar with the Colorado oil and gas disclosure and PFAS ban law that's been referenced in this hearing?
Only at the highest level.
Do you know about the community notification provisions of that law?
I am not.
Are you aware of any chemophobia that's happening in Colorado as a result of that law?
I have not looked into it.
Are you aware of any chemophobia that's happening in California as a result of its oil and gas chemical disclosure law?
I have not looked into it.
You cite a document that is entitled Scared to Death to support your testimony about chemophobia. Is that correct?
I believe the title is longer than that. It's the Entine 2011.
That's right. I'll
Yeah.
read the full title. The title is Scared to Death: How Chemophobia Threatens Public Health, a position statement of the American Council on Science and Health. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
This is a position statement of the American Council on Science and Health. Would you agree with that?
As stated, yes.
Would you agree that the American Council on Science and Health is a pro-industry advocacy group?
I actually don't know anything about them.
Were you aware that the American Council on Science and Health, the founding of that organization, was funded by Paul Orifice?
Objection.
What's your objection?
Dr. Anderson just said she doesn't know anything about who founded them, and he's asking her additional questions about that.
I have not asked, I have not finished my question actually
Yeah.
about who funded the founding. This is exhibit E25, I believe. It's an exhibit to her testimony.
It-
I
it's
believe
an
I can prove
exhibit,
that.
But anything about the founding of it is not part of that exhibit.
I can ask her if she's aware.
Great, he can explore that. Go ahead.
Where was I? Were you aware that the creation of the American Council on Science and Health, the founding of that organization, was funded by Paul Orifice? Were you aware that Paul Orifice was the president of Dow Chemical? You cite the Flint water crisis as an example of chemophobia in your testimony. Is that correct?
Yes. Sorry, my mic turned off. It's an example of psychological distress in a community.
To be clear, people in Flint were poisoned by the water they were drinking. Is that correct?
People in Flint had elevated levels of lead in their water, yes.
Would you disagree that they were poisoned by that lead?
I don't know how you define poison.
Would you agree with the statement that the people in Flint who drank lead contaminated water suffered adverse health impacts?
Actually, I don't know the medical records of the people in Flint. I do know they were exposed to lead, some of them.
You're a toxicologist?
Yes, sir.
Would you agree that lead can have adverse health impacts?
Of course.
Would you agree that lead in drinking water is a pathway to exposure?
Of course.
Would you agree that the government responsible in Flint, Michigan, withheld information from the people who were affected by that contamination?
Objection.
I think you need a foundational question there. She said she doesn't really know much about the Flint situation. So I think you have to ask her if she knows about the Flint.
Did you reference the Flint water crisis as an example to support your chemophobia testimony?
I believe there's a publication that I referenced that talks about the psychological distress that occurred in that community. Yes.
I'll move along. On page 14 to 15 of your direct testimony, you state, "It is often assumed that presenting the public and stakeholders with factual information is always in the public's best interest, and that stakeholders will be readily able to develop appropriate," and then you have a quote here, quote, "beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors related to a given risk." Do you recall that testimony?
Again, I don't have it in front of me, but it sounds accurate. Yes.
Just for the record, this is NMOGA Exhibit E25. That quote, "beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors related to a given risk," is from the US EPA Exhibit E25, is that correct?
If that's the website with the SALT framework, yes.
It may be helpful for me to try and share my screen here.
Sheila, please give him permission.
How did I know this would happen? May I approach the witness to hand her a copy of her testimony?
Yes. And by the way, we do have one extra notebook up here with all the exhibits.
I've placed in front of you a copy of your direct testimony in this matter. And I just wanted to make sure that you agree that that is your testimony that I've placed in front of you.
Is it okay if I scroll just a little bit?
For sure.
Okay, thank you. Ooh, Mac scrolls opposite. Yes, it looks right.
And specifically the phrase that I just, I don't know, 5 minutes ago quoted was from a US EPA document that is labeled as NMOGA Exhibit E25, but the quote is beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors related to a given risk.
Yes, that's correct.
Do you agree that's the portion of your testimony that is quoted and attributed to the US EPA?
Yes,
And do you agree that the word immediately preceding that, appropriate, is your word?
I believe so.
So my question is, who can develop appropriate beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors related to a given risk? Specifically, an oil field worker who's given access to chemical information, can he develop appropriate beliefs related to that risk?
Can you ask the question again? I'm not sure I understand.
Sure. Your testimony is that it's not always in the public's best interest and the stakeholders will readily strike that, please. Your testimony is that it's often assumed that presenting the public and stakeholders with factual information is always in the public's best interest, and the stakeholders will be readily able to develop appropriate beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors related to a given risk. So my question is whether an oil field worker can develop appropriate beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors related to a given risk if that oil field worker has access to the chemicals that are being used at a well site where he works.
So the very next sentence after that, what you're reading says, according to the EPA, US EPA, research has shown this not to be true. And I think you have to recognize that it's always in the public's interest. So I think it depends. And you're giving me a hypothetical, and I can't answer because it will depend.
The word appropriate is your word?
I believe it is.
Is your testimony in front of you?
Yes. What I'm saying is I don't know if EPA used the word appropriate because I don't have it in quotes.
If EPA used the word appropriate, you didn't put that in quotes.
I can look if you'd like me to.
As you're sitting here reading it right now, it appears to be your word.
That's why I said I believe it is, yes.
I want to ask you about CAS numbers.
Do you want this back or me to keep it?
I can get it. May I approach?
It's just hard to see you. I'm sorry.
Are you familiar with CAS numbers?
Chemical Abstract Services Registry numbers, yes.
Those are unique chemical identifiers.
Yes, in most cases. Yeah.
Anyone can take that number and do a Google search to find out information about a given chemical.
You should be able to, yes.
A member of the public has a CAS number. Do they need someone with special training or experience to look up what chemical that refers to?
To look up the chemical name?
Yeah, sure.
No.
Could they relay a CAS number to a healthcare provider?
You mean communicate the CAS number directly to their healthcare provider?
Yes.
Of course.
Earlier this morning, well, strike that. Earlier this morning, Namoga's lawyer, I think, jokingly asked you if Paxlovid has ever been used in New Mexico oil and gas operations. I actually want to ask you that question. Do you know if Paxlovid's ever been used in New Mexico oil and gas operations?
I don't.
Do you know if any specific PFAS has ever been used in New Mexico oil and gas operations?
As I answered earlier, only what I've seen disclosed in the Prac Focus.
So the reason that you know they've been used is because they've been disclosed.
Correct.
I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Let's see, so that is Guardians, NEE. We move to the division. Mr. Tremaine.
Madam Hearing Examiner, I believe my questions have been covered.
Terrific. Thank you very much. EOG has said they would not have questions. Mr. Maxwell, do you have questions of Dr. Anderson?
I do not have questions for Dr. Anderson. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Mulcahy, do you have any redirect before I go to the commission?
Thank you. I have just one question. Dr. Anderson, Mr. Davis asked you, just because we do not have toxicology data does not mean that the PFAS for which we have no data are not toxic, correct? Do you recall that question?
If that's how he worded it, I think so.
Just because we do not have toxicology data for every PFAS, does that mean that they are toxic?
No, it does not.
Thank you. Nothing further.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Mulcahy. Let's go to the commission. Mr. Chair, do you have questions of Dr. Anderson?
I do, Madam Hearing Officer. Thank you. Just a few questions. First off, thank you, Dr. Anderson. Very informative. We appreciate it. Like we've appreciated all of our experts on this. Dr. Anderson, just to make sure, I heard that you're a board certified toxicologist.
Yes,
correct?
I am.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure that I heard that correctly. Doctor, in your direct testimony on page 4, there's 2 bullet points. The second bullet point, you state, and I'll just quote it. I know you don't have a copy in front of you, but if you'll just hear me out and tell me if it sounds correctly. You said some compounds broadly identified as PFAS, and then you open a parenthesis, you say, i.e., compounds that contain a single fully fluorinated methyl or methylene carbon moiety, close parentheses, are routinely used as pharmaceuticals prescribed to children and adults, such as Lipitor, Flonase, Paxlovid, and Prozac, and are often prescribed with dosing regimens that maintain long-term exposure levels but have been deemed safe for human use. I'm sure you could see as a commission here that poses a little bit of a difference when we hear about PFAS. Do you mind just delving a little more into that, maybe clearing the mud up for us?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The key is that fluorines are attached to drugs all the time. And I'm not a pharmacologist, so I don't exactly know what it does to help the drug in the body. But from one of the references that I included there, there's a count of over 300, I think it was like over 360 today on the market, drugs that include a fully fluorinated carbon, just one, Oh, I guess I should say one or more. I don't know. It depends how you define it. And that is part of the problem. Well, first, let me back up. As actually even explained really nicely by Dr. Hansen, drugs go through a really rigorous testing program, very, very tight toxicology, pharmacology regulations. So we understand the safe exposure, right? Again, recall everything may have some toxic properties, but we understand that if we are administering the exposure of these drugs to people at a certain frequency, duration, rate, that it will impart the intended consequence, not cause more adverse effects. And so I think that's where the challenge is with using that definition, is that you're bringing in a whole class of chemistries that do not have surfactant-like properties. They are not considered stable or persistent. And they have really robust toxicity information associated with them. The reality is most people don't think of pharmaceuticals when you're thinking of PFAS. I'm sure that's not the intent, but by using that as part of the chemical definition, you're bringing that in. We also know, increasing body of literature, that septic waste, individual septic waste, is a potential contributor to PFAS in the environment. Now, do we care if it's a breakdown product of Lipitor? Probably not. But if you're detecting fluorines or organofluorines, you might pick it up and then wrongly associate it with, an AFFF release or something else, right?
Okay.
Does that help?
It did, because I actually appreciated our public comment this morning with our veteran who had about the fire retardant and how it has affected him. And
yes,
so we hear these things, but then in your testimony you're saying that these pharmaceuticals have it as well.
Yeah.
And so you can see the conundrum that it causes for this commission when we're looking at PFAS.
Let me clarify what I'm certain that gentleman was speaking to. When he was showing his blood results, those are the typical PFAS that we are concerned about. Those are specifically
Sure.
PFOS, PFOA, most likely, right? Because that's what's tested in the blood,
Okay.
especially associated with AFFF. So the blood testing isn't going to pick up the pharmaceuticals. They're degrading. They're probably not going to be in his body. So I don't want you to confuse his testimony with perhaps because he's on Lipitor. That's not at all. Yeah.
No, I realized it wasn't
Yeah.
coming from Lipitor.
Okay.
I got that. But what I'm trying to say is when we're looking at this broad sense,
Yeah.
Pharmaceuticals are in it as well, plus other daily items if
That's
you
right.
do a broad search on this. So now, if we look at, I believe you were here for most of the testimony that has gone on, and
Yes,
I
sir.
believe you had heard that at the very basic, the OECD definition for PFAS, which is what the chemistry community has taken. So at the very basis, and again, I realize you're not a chemist,
Mhm,
so I'm going to preface that. But at the very basis, from what you know
Mhm.
of general chemistry, plus your background of toxicology, even these pharmaceuticals fall under PFAS, under
You-
that definition.
Using that broadest definition, yes.
Okay, thank you.
If I may just interrupt for a moment, if there's more questions about what stuff in her testimony, I have a copy of it here. I'm happy to provide it to the witness just so the commissioners can ask her about it. I don't know if that's okay.
I think that may be helpful, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I would
Okay.
represent on the record, there's no notes or anything in this. It's just her.
All right, thank you.
Sorry, I know. Boy, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
So, Doctor, thank you. Appreciate it. There was also the slides that you went through with Ms. Mulcahy earlier, and you were talking about polymers and monomers. And just so I get it straight in my head, it's been a while since I've done some chemistry, so my apologies for that. I believe you stated that polymers are kind of big and bulky, and you equated them to the football field, and monomers were the marbles. And so when we're looking at the toxicological effects, the concern is that monomers are the ones that tend to affect us more. Most any, I guess, these would be the ones that would be binding to proteins in humans and potentially causing adverse reactions.
Correct.
Okay. And then I believe you stated that PFOS and PFOAs are the ones that are small enough that could potentially cause us issues.
Correct.
Okay. Just so I know, again, for me, the methodologies that were presented as testing methodologies, targeted analyses for these compounds, would they be able to detect PFOA and PFOS? Do you know?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
Just to be clear, you're talking about the standardized EPA methods.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. And I should have said those. Ms. Mulcahy, I believe it said all the numbers to them, and I believe the OCD also has it in their definition.
Correct.
Okay.
PFOA and PFAS are on all of the drinking water methods and the groundwater method.
Okay. Thank you for that. You stated to everybody in the room and on the platform that the EPA released an update on their screening and increased it to 31 PFAS.
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay. Can you just, again, because we've talked about targeted analysis and screenings and all that, your understanding of what this screening is?
Good question, and I apologize for not clarifying that better. This is the EPA regional screening level table. You can Google it and find it. It's publicly available. It is what risk assessors and toxicologists and regulators across the country use to determine whether more evaluation at a given Superfund or contaminated site is necessary. So you'll have a sample of, let's say, groundwater, and it'll have a concentration of chemical X. You look at the table and you find the lowest number, the most conservative, usually the residential. That'll be it. And you see if that concentration in your sample is above or below.
Okay.
If it's below, we have high confidence that we're not causing, there's not concern, there's no increased concern for that chemical in that sample. If it's above, we need to do more evaluation. There might be risk. We might need more data. You might need to do a full risk assessment. So it's a screening level to, are you no concern, or do you need to do more work to figure out what your concern is?
Okay.
And those screening levels are available for, gosh, I don't even know, maybe 600 chemicals are on the full list. Groundwater, soil, surface water, air even, and for different receptors. These are human health based. So residential, construction worker, and I think like an indoor worker even for some reason.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Also, I believe it was the questioning that Ms. Mulcahy had for you, and you clarified that you're concerned with a specific statement that Dr. Hansen said. Dr. Hansen, I guess, said linked to one or several health effects, and you said it was better to say associated with. Obviously, it's a play on words, and I was trying to follow your line of reasoning, and I apologize. It was just a little bit overload on info. Could you clarify that for me as well, please?
It's just the more technically appropriate way that toxicologists and risk assessors refer to a body of literature associating a given chemical's exposure to an adverse health effect. You'll most commonly see associated with, and in fact, ATSDR, I don't know everywhere, because again, I don't know what her citation was, but usually uses associated with.
Okay.
That's all.
Okay. It's just the way the lingo is used between the groups. Okay. I appreciate that. Thank you. In your testimony, in your direct testimony, you have a whole section, and find where it's at. I underlined it, and now I can't find my underlines. So please forgive me. On page 14, you start off with the chemophobia. And I guess I understand the premise of it. But again, as a commission, as a body that's set to make a rule or change these rules, I guess in your expertise as a toxicologist, and you did mention it, but just clarify it in my head. Why would this cause chemophobia for the people of New Mexico if they knew what was in this, whatever the substances are? I guess, no offense, doctor, I know you're coming with your opinion and your information, but it kind of sounds like you're saying the people of New Mexico can't make their own decisions on this. They'll freak out and we'll have hysteria in the state.
Sure, that's not at all what I'm saying. So what I'm saying is, and there's a whole body of literature on this, not just the one article. I think they're the ones that officially coined the term. But what it's pointing to is we need to consider the psychological distress. And again, no judgment on whether it's valid or not. We're not invalidating the feelings, but that needs to be taken in consideration. And we know from risk communication and social science that people perceive risk in a different way than we expect. It's not a fact-based perception of risk. And so the social science and the best practices around risk communication are really clear that you have to give people information about risk in context.
Okay.
And so we know that just a list of chemicals, there's even been studies where people have, researchers went around and talked to people about dihydrooxygen. And people freaked out. It's water, because they hear a chemical name. Now, of course, probably quickly they were like, oh, it's just water. But the point is that people need to have the right information in the right context. And so disclosure of information, and again, to be clear, we are proposing full disclosure of information to OCD to allow them to work through the process, which, as I understand it, in normal cleanup programs, and so I would assume it's same here, there is an opportunity to talk to the public, but you do it sort of in that process, right?
Okay. I see the clarification. Thank you for that. My last question to you is, as I said, you've been here for the majority. As you mentioned, you weren't here for the very first part on Tuesday, but you were also able to see the Oil Conservation Division's definition for PFAS. Does vary from the definition that NMOGA is proposing. Why is the NMOGA better?
Sure. Well, what I first want to say is in practice, in reality, for enforcement and sampling, the definitions are the same. You end up at the same place. When considering a definition, I think Dr. Richardson and I came at it assuming, of course, you're going to use the standard EPA methods. That's what we always use.
Okay.
It's helpful, I do agree, to have them enumerated so there's no ambiguity. And I especially appreciate the evergreen nature of it. I think that's actually pretty critical. We've seen this analyte list grow, even just in recent history, and can assume that it will. Why is ours better? I think the end of the day, it comes down to a focus of the PFAS that, one, already adopted by EPA under their TSCA program. Two, as stated by EPA, and I personally, professionally agree, encompasses the PFAS of most relevance and concern for this rulemaking. It's still a broad net. So our definition of 2 or more is thousands of PFAS. In practicality, enforcing that, you use the limits. So I think at the end of the day, the analytical methods are what they are. It's not our ability to change them and make it go any faster. The definition just needs to ensure that it's protective of public health. And as I mentioned earlier, all of our definitions encompass the ones that really warrant the concern based on data we have today. Secondly, it needs to be enforceable and tangible, something that we all understand. I appreciate the added clarity of the methods that were laid out by the Oil and Gas Division.
Okay, and I'm going to ask also the question because it's fair. We're looking at Wild Earth Guardian's definition as well. Wild Earth Guardian's definition, if I'm going to, I play devil's advocate for lack of a better term, is going to stop all PFAS from ever being used. Why is it more prudent to look at the definition that NMOGA submitted in lieu of the definition that Wild Earth Guardians submitted?
I think it comes down to the executable and enforceable question. So we heard a lot of conversations this week about use of non-targeted analysis and use of non-standardized labs. I'm not sure if that's even an option under a regulatory program. It's very much of a research type of endeavor. So that, I guess, ambiguity would need to be clarified. And the reality is, when you are in a site where there has been a release and you're trying to interpret the data, you want to make sure you're collecting reliable, repeatable, validated data that you can make sense of. And if you're, I guess, at the end of the day, we're all going to be collecting that same data using those methods, assuming that's the standardized methods. So in that effect, as I said earlier, there's really not at the practical level very much difference between the three definitions. It's where do you want the specificity documented, and where do you want to draw the line about what matters to the environment and to the oil and gas as far as the requirement for the full ban.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Mhm.
No further questions for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Bloom.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Anderson.
Good afternoon.
And my first question was Jerry's last question, but
Perfect.
it's all right. You may have said all you want to say on that, but yeah, I'll ask anyhow. How does NMOGA's PFAS definition help us more as regulators over OCDs or Wild Earth Guardians?
Again, I don't really think it's materially or practically any different than OCDs. I really don't.
And we've heard this throughout the past few days, but I think it was 23 or 26 some states use this broader definition of PFAS that Wild Earth Guardians is using. Did those states get it wrong, or?
No, but I do think that the devil's in the details of those regulations. And so many of them are industry specific, and also looking at industries that may also have single fluorinated carbons in them. Also, I believe that every single one of those definitions does narrow the scope to intentionally added. And so by doing that, they are also narrowing the scope to those PFAS that have the physical and chemical properties that would most likely be used, right? The surfactant nature, the stability. So again, kind of getting to the same place.
Okay. Dr. Anderson, you said that the NMOGA definition gets at, quote, the PFAS of highest concern.
Yes, and that's EPA's conclusion first.
When you say highest concern, is that because of toxicity or because of the widespread use of those PFAS?
Both.
Okay.
So remember, you need to have the exposure. So these are the ones that are most likely to be in the environment. They've been used, and then you have to have the potential for risk.
Okay. Let's write that down. So you spent a good bit of time this morning saying that some PFAS and polymers are too big to be toxic. Is that correct?
They're too big to be even absorbed through a cell wall.
Okay. And could they be toxic or dangerous to human health? Do we know?
Highly unlikely and doubtful. For PTFE, again, we have decades and decades of use in the medical device industry with no data. We actually even have a rat study where they fed PTFE powders up to 25% in the rat's diet. Again, it's not water soluble, so it was a powder mixed in with their chow and saw no adverse effects. It's in rats, but.
Yeah. And you said some are too small?
Some of the PFAS?
Yes.
Too small for?
Danger to human health?
Again, as a toxicologist, unfortunately, I have to be really accurate. The size of the molecule dictates how it may move through our bodies. And so the smaller PFAS do not get taken back up to by our kidneys. So they're not bioaccumulative. They don't bind to the proteins the same way. Now, if you have a sufficient enough exposure and a sufficient enough dose, anything may cause adverse effects. So I just want to be very clear.
I appreciate the caveats. So essentially what we're looking at are sort of the Goldilocks PFAS, not too big, not too small, right?
That's it exactly.
Okay. And are there other PFAS in that Goldilocks territory, not too big, not too small, that we don't have an understanding yet of their potential health effects?
So size is not the only consideration when we talk about big and small. It's really how they bind to the receptors and what they're going to do. EPA has come up with 112 different categories for PFAS based on the chemical structure. I can only imagine that there are some of those 112 specific subcategories that may warrant additional testing, or that they are working through the analysis, right? So they have, as I mentioned previously, they're doing rodent studies on over 100. They are running thousands through in silico and in vitro testing. And they are actually initiating what's the new testing orders, which is one of the exhibits that I cite, where they're getting information on some of these subcategories on a surrogate. So they acknowledge you can't extrapolate between different categories, but we need to fill some data gaps. And so unfortunately, I just can't answer that question, but it is a very active area of research, and it's well recognized that it's the subcategories, the grouping of these PFAS based on physical chemical characteristics to include size, that really is going to dictate concern, in addition to production volume and potential release to the environment.
Are those 112 categories all covered by the NMOGA proposed definition?
I would doubt it, but I would need to confirm. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, by the NMOGA definition. Yes, it would be, because that's under the TSCA program. So I apologize.
Okay. In my previous job, I got to work on TSCA reauthorization. My understanding was that we were seriously behind, this is 4 or 5 years ago, on PFAS health-related toxicology studies. Are those still forthcoming? Are we still behind?
What do you mean by behind?
Behind to me means that we released potentially dangerous toxic chemicals into our supply chains and unleash them into the environment. They're being absorbed by our bodies, and we don't know the health effects.
By my latest count, TSCA had listed somewhere around 40,000 chemicals that are in commerce today. You know, we don't have toxicity information on the vast majority, unfortunately. So I just think it's the way the TSCA program is set up.
Yeah. Getting close to wrapping up here. That is it. Thank you. Appreciate it, Dr. Anderson.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Commissioner Ampoma.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. I'll make it very brief. You do have a copy of your direct testimony. I'm going to walk through that a little bit. There are no pages here. Okay, on page 3 of your direct testimony, item number 6. So in there you talk about work states that PFAS are an exceptionally toxic group of chemicals that present married long-term and persistent public health. Now you're saying that this statement is factually inaccurate and misleading. So my question to you is that, is it NMOGA's position that the commission should not ban all PFAS?
Could you repeat the question? Should not?
Is it NMOGA's position that the commission should not ban all PFAS.
Okay, no, it's my position that the definition for how you define PFAS in your ban needs to be something that can be enforced and is tangible, has no ambiguity. But I agree with that caveat of banning PFAS for use in hydraulic fracturing.
So let's be more specific on that. So NIMOGA's position is to more or less supporting science-based ban of PFAS.
Correct, which is personally why I also appreciate the evergreen nature of OCDs added, because we understand the science is going to evolve.
Okay. Okay, I think I went through this one. On page 8, the earlier paragraphs. Moreover, of nearly 184,000 records of hydraulic fracturing projects in frac focus nationwide, only approximately 1,600 reports of use of PFAS. So do you know specifically how much of these have been used in New Mexico?
I do not, and I want to be clear, I'm citing the GSI response paper that's the Connor et al. I'm a co-author on that, but I wrote the toxicology and regulatory piece.
And you didn't write the portion that reviewed the materials from frac focus?
Correct. That's why they're cited.
Okay. I'm pretty sure that Nimoga's next witness probably can help us on that one.
Correct. You
Yeah,
will.
so I'll save that. I'll save that. Now, in that same paper, so as we go down, you're just talking about 99% of the hydraulic fracturing projects were more without any such additives. But when you come down, you talk about with many thousands of hydraulic fracturing projects completed in the US, there is no evidence of already impacted regions where hydraulic fracturing has impaired groundwater or surface water. So you cited Connor et al. 2021. Are there any additional references to support this claim?
I haven't seen any references to support the contrary.
Yeah, and also based on the testimonies that we've gone throughout from Tuesday up until now, especially from WEC's witnesses, how about the operational issues that they pointed out? Looking at what happened in Pennsylvania and even in West Virginia, do you still hold this statement to be true?
I didn't critically evaluate those studies, so I think you'll have to ask Dr. Richardson. But as quoted from that paper and from the analysis of my colleagues, I would agree with it, yes.
Okay, I'll put that down to ask the next witness.
Sorry, Dr. Richardson.
Now, with regards to Nimoga's definition that proposing with regards to PFAS, how many chemicals are we dealing with here?
Oh, I was really afraid someone was going to ask this question. I can't tell you. It is thousands. Our definition, that's what you're asking. The Nimoga, yes, it's still thousands. There's no good database to filter and try to get that information out. I apologize.
Okay, let's work through that a little bit. So this one, I'm looking at the proposed PFAS definition, Nimoga rebuttal exhibit E30. So I'm looking at the chart that you showed where you have the PFAS, you have polymers and non-polymers. So I'm going to focus on definitely you said that the PTFE, those ones are big.
Correct.
We've already talked about that. So I'm not going to focus on that. And also you've talked about the PFOA and then PFOS. Those are mostly the toxic ones. Is that true? Is that correct?
Correct. They're the ones that have the very low regulatory values in this country.
Okay. So the other one, that is the polyfluoroalkyl substances. That is one on the extreme right on the chat.
Dr. Ampoma,
Yes.
if I may interrupt, if it would be helpful for you, I'm happy to project that up on the
That'll be
screen.
fine. Yeah, I don't
I'm
have.
sorry, I don't
I
have a
can't
copy
project.
of that in paper for the
Yeah,
witness.
I
My
can't project.
apologies.
Okay.
You can keep going though. I know what you're
Okay. Sure.
referring to.
So I'm focusing on the last part, the polyfluoroalkyl substances. And probably Nimoga next witness can probably respond to this, but I'll ask anyway. This family of PFAS, has it been used in the oil and gas industry?
I cannot answer that question.
Okay. You talk about they can degrade.
The poly.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Can degrade. Can it be toxic?
Which the poly?
Uh-huh.
So that class of chemicals does include Gen X already. So that's one of the ones that we do have an MCL for. The 6,2-FTOH and a myriad of other compounds for which we do have toxicity information for and threshold values. Yes.
And some of them are a little bit toxic or
Some
highly
of
toxic?
them at certain exposure levels and depending on how you're exposed can be associated with adverse health effects. Yeah.
Okay. So does OCD and Nimoga's definition includes this type of PFAS?
Yes. Our
Okay.
definition includes everything you would see on the
Everything.
screen
On this. Okay.
in that subfamily. Yeah.
Okay. Then what is not included in your definition that you can share with us?
Only the single fluorinated compounds. So the carbons, only the compounds that have one carbon that has fluorines fully attached. That's it.
And that is the fundamental of WEC's definition too.
That's what they start their definition.
Starting
We
with.
start ours at the next layer up. Yeah.
What about OCD's definition?
There's that, the first part of their definition, because they have that two-part, matches WEG's.
Okay.
I'm sorry, do you prefer to be called guardians?
Yes, everywhere. WEC.
We call ourselves guardians, but
Guardians, okay.
I think people know what you are referring to when you say WEG.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay. Now, does Nimoga's definition accounts for future growth of PFAS that could be added?
Yes, it does, because our definition does include thousands of chemicals, right? Under the assumption that as executed and enforced in the environment, those analytical methods will continue to grow.
Okay. Now, let me ask you this, and probably you can pass that on too. What is the impact of the potential burn of PFAS on Nimoga?
I cannot answer that question.
Okay, definitely. I'll save that. Okay. You know, there has been a lot of testimonies presented to us throughout the whole week. I want to ask you, is there anything that you agree with the other witnesses?
Is there an issue that I
that you agree with all the other witnesses, especially from guardians?
Of course, yeah. I mean, I think we're all in agreement that it's prudent to ban. By some definition is where we disagree, PFAS and hydraulic fracturing fluid. We're all in agreement that disclosure of all the chemicals used is prudent. To whom is where we disagree. And as we've heard in multiple testimonies, we're all in agreement that there are concern for certain PFAS in the environment and that those concerns are extremely valid.
Okay. There's one item that sounds like nobody has talked about. I'll ask about it. On page 11, I also recommend that the revised language include intentionally added as part of the definition of PFAS. So based on all the testimonies that we've listened to throughout the whole week, do you still stand by that?
I do. I think in my mind that provides the specificity to the industry. And I think that's just important.
It's important. Now, NMOCD is striking that down. So how do you see this will impact Nimoga?
I can't answer for how that would impact Nimoga. It's my understanding from listening to the testimony, though, that they're going to clarify that this applies to the additives. And that's essentially the same thing.
Okay, so you're just going to be focused on the additives and not necessarily, let's say, stream water or whatever water that was
That's my
used.
understanding from listening to the testimony here this week. Yeah.
And does that satisfy the intentionally added PFAS?
I believe it does. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Any reason not to excuse Dr. Anderson at this time? Nope. Thank you very much for your testimony, Dr. Anderson.
My pleasure. And it's been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe you might have left it there because we were leaving. Oh, okay. Oh, the first one. Okay. Oh, okay, interesting.
May I have just a moment to get the giant binder for Dr. Richardson?
Yes.
Thank you.
This was. D. Okay. Commissioners, so the black binder that start with Exhibit A that we had earlier, D is in that same binder. Okay.
Oh, there we go. So that's on? Okay.
Does the commission have a copy of Dr. Richardson's? There is a copy of it back
Yeah.
there. Okay, or I just, whenever you're ready, when everybody has their giant binders, you just let me know. Yeah.
Madam Hearing Officer, before we start with the next witness, I would like to move Wild Earth Guardians Exhibits 1, which is the First Amendment proposed rule, and Wild Earth Guardians Exhibit 2, which is the proposed legal notice, into evidence.
All right, thank you. Any objections to Guardians 1 and 2? Okay, they're admitted. Thank you.
Sorry again.
Dr. Richardson, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Go ahead, Miss. Okay.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Richardson.
Hello.
Dr. Richardson, could you please spell your name for the record?
Last name is Richardson, Richardson. And first name is Stephen, Stephen.
Thank you. Dr. Richardson, did you provide direct written testimony, which is marked as Exhibit D as in dog, and attached Exhibits D1 through D14 for this hearing?
I did.
Do you have any changes or additions to your direct testimony and exhibits today?
I do not.
Do you adopt your written testimony marked as Exhibit D as your sworn testimony today?
I do.
Is your testimony true and accurate to the best of your knowledge?
It is.
Okay. Madam Hearing Officer, I would move for the admission of NMOGA Exhibits D as in dog through D14.
All right. Any objections to NMOGA Exhibits D through D14? Okay, they're admitted. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Richardson, could you please provide a brief summary of your testimony today?
Yeah, happy to. Again, my name is Steve Richardson. I'm a environmental engineer with GSI Environmental, and one of my charges under in my work with NMOGA here, there's 3 of them. One is to assist with the definition of PFAS, as Dr. Anderson had mentioned. Second is to look at frac focus disclosure, looking at the PSR, the Physicians for Social Responsibility report, and see, basically try to recreate their numbers, so to speak, and come up with my own review of those, of the disclosure. And then third, from a fate and transport standpoint of PFAS in the environment. So to provide that level of expertise as well. So how would PFAS move in the environment? And then how does that tie in with what Dr. Anderson had mentioned today? To that end, the take home here is that, again, as Dr. Anderson mentioned, our proposed definition is one that mirrors or is very similar to the EPA TSCA definition, right? And so that's been already mentioned. Second, in terms of the frac focus disclosure, we ended up with very similar results to what was in the PSR document in terms of the PFAS that had been disclosed, and that's PTFE, polytetrafluoroethylene, and then the big one, which we've shortened as FPEG, which is alcohol substituted polyethylene glycol. And I hope that's the only time I have to say that in this hearing. So that is FPEG. And again, that's not a true acronym for it. It's something we came up with to make it easier so that we didn't have an additional 10 pages in our testimony. And then last was to really discuss, should there be PFAS in the environment, how would they behave? And then in terms of, how would a polymer behave that is poorly water soluble versus one that may be a smaller chain and more mobile? What does that look like? And so that's where my expertise came in.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. I'm going to pull up what has been labeled as Guardians Exhibit 8, if you can give me just one moment.
Sure.
And Madam Hearing Officer, may I share my screen?
Yes, Sheila, please give her permission.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Richardson, did you review Guardians Exhibit 8?
I did.
Is Guardians Exhibit 8 the statutes and regulations from other states that have banned PFAS?
That's correct.
Did you, in your review of Guardians Exhibit 8, notice anything in common about all of these examples from other states?
Yes, and as has been previously stated, all of these use the one fully fluorinated carbon definition. Second, I believe has already been mentioned, they're also industry specific, as you can see in the parentheses that are going through. And then third, which was just briefly mentioned at the end, is that they all do include, as part of their regulations, intentionally added some component, whether it's intentionally added PFAS or just intentionally added as part of their rule.
I'm going to pull up just one specific definition in this exhibit. I don't want to go through all of them, but sorry about, I'm not trying to make anybody motion sick. Dr. Anderson, sorry, Dr. Richardson, are
It's going to be challenging today, just
Yeah.
to let you know. Okay.
Dr. Richardson, are we looking at the Maryland statute here that I've pulled up on the screen?
Yes, we are.
I'm going to read from the yellow highlighted part. Intentionally added. Intentionally added means the act of deliberately using a chemical in the formation of a product where the chemical's continued presence is desired in the product to provide a specific characteristic. Did I read that correctly?
You did.
Is this Maryland definition that I just read out loud here on Wild Earth Guardians Exhibit 8 similar to the definition of intentionally added in all of these other states?
They're all very similar, yes.
Based on your extensive knowledge of PFAS, does it make sense to include intentionally added as a definition in this rulemaking?
In my opinion, yes. And really that's what it comes down to. PFAS, as we've discussed already in this hearing, there are a variety of different sources. It's not the way I would look at it is in my career, I've dealt with petroleum hydrocarbons, chlorinated solvents. Now I spend a lot of time doing PFAS remediation, treatment and remediation. Chlorinated solvents in the environment are very easy to figure out what the source is. There's not going to be very many, right? So if it's a dry cleaner, well, there's your dry cleaner right there. With PFAS, it's very different because there can be a variety of different sources and because their ubiquitous nature, as we've discussed. They're in our consumer products. We consume them. They're in our wastewater. They're in our septic systems. Now they're in our surface water and so on. So in this case, when you're talking about adding intentionally added, this is not a terminology you would usually use with another contaminant, another class of contaminants. This is one that is really unique to PFAS. Because at the end of the day, it's very hard at the end to determine where that PFAS came from, right? Whether it's if we're using source water in the case for hydraulic fracturing, that could be municipal water, that could be private well water, which could be already containing PFAS in it.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. Did NMOGA include a definition of intentionally added in its proposed revisions?
They did.
And could you explain why NMOGA did include that?
For exactly that reason, yeah, just the source water aspect, right? Again, water being close to 99%. It's a very large component of a frac job. And so at the end of the day, when you're dealing with the source water being containing PFAS, then that has to be taken into account.
Would it be fair then to say, Dr. Richardson, that NMOGA's proposal is consistent with the states identified here in Guardians Exhibit 8?
It is consistent with respect to intentionally added, yes.
Okay. And Dr. Richardson, did you hear the testimony from Mr. Powell this week?
I did.
And did you hear the testimony that the Oil Conservation Division has proposed a definition that doesn't necessarily say intentionally added, but makes clear that the division is focused on the chemical additives?
I did.
Would you agree with that approach as well?
I certainly think that they do align. Yeah, I do think that there's some similarities there that we could look at, yes.
Dr. Richardson, did you review Guardian's definition of PFAS?
I did.
Dr. Richardson, did you review Dr. Hansen's definition of PFAS?
I did.
Were they similar?
Yes, they were similar. That one fully fluorinated definition.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pull up what is Guardian's Exhibit 1. Dr. Richardson, is this Guardian's definition of PFAS that I have displayed here on the screen in Guardian's Exhibit 1?
It is.
Do you agree with Guardian's definition of PFAS as displayed here?
I do not.
Why not?
For the reasons that Dr. Anderson had mentioned before, again, that we are focused on PFAS that are the most relevant. And right now, as was mentioned before, our definition excludes the single fully fluorinated, single fully fluorinated compounds, right? And there's reason for that. One reason being that in a hydraulic fracturing situation, you're going to want to use, in the cases where PFAS have been used and disclosed in Frac Focus, they were used mainly for friction reduction. And we know that hydraulic fracturing is a high temperature, high pressure situation. And so those types of compounds would not be useful in any way in a hydraulic fracturing job. So in terms of narrowing, I mean, I guess it's still a very broad definition. I'll make sure that's clear. And then the other part being that in terms of the methods, right, we know that the single fully fluorinated are not covered by or are outside of the methods that were listed, right, through OCD's definition.
And so when you say outside the methods, you mean outside the standardized methods that the division listed in its definition? That's
correct. They're not currently in those definitions or in those methods.
And so when you say in those methods, do you mean that those analytical methods cannot analyze for single fully fluorinated carbons?
They cannot.
So how would a method, without a method, sorry, let me back up for a second here. I just want to clarify something. Would a single fully fluorinated carbon atom be any use in hydraulic fracturing?
From my research and understanding of how hydraulic fracturing works, no.
And
let me just clarify, from a friction reduction standpoint, which is really where I've focused.
Okay. Yeah. Without a method to test for a single fully fluorinated carbon atom, how would a regulator use this definition to regulate?
They wouldn't.
Would a regulator be able to enforce a ban on PFAS under Guardian and Dr. Hansen's definition of a single fully fluorinated carbon atom?
No.
Why not?
Because there's no way to actually analyze for them. There's not an enforceable way to do anything, to execute that rule.
Thank you. I'm going to now pull up New Energy Economy Exhibit A, which is Dr. Hansen's direct testimony. I'm just scrolling before I reshare so I don't make everybody motion sick. Dr. Richardson, did you review Dr. Hansen's direct testimony?
I did.
Okay. I'm going to read from page 8, lines 18 through 20 of Dr. Hansen's direct testimony. Dr. Hansen states, PFAS are mobile in the environment, e.g. via air, atmospheric deposition, groundwater, rain/snow, desorption from soil/sludge, surface water, sea foam, and thus are not easily contained or controlled. Did I read that correctly?
You did.
Dr. Richardson, do you agree with this statement?
No, not entirely, no.
Okay, let's break it down. Are there any parts that you can agree with?
Well, I think it's fair to say that we do know that PFAS, there are papers out there that show that PFAS is up in the Arctic, right? That it's in snow, that it's in rain at certain locations. There are papers that do support that. So I think from a not easily contained or controlled aspect, I think I could say that I would agree. However, from a PFAS are all mobile or mobile in the environment, that would be incorrect. We do have PFAS that are not mobile at all. And again, we've gone through this with the large molecule versus the small molecule discussion, which we can go into again if you'd like.
Okay. I don't want to go into the entire discussion again, but I am curious from your perspective in the environmental remediation world. We heard about it from Dr. Anderson in terms of toxicology, but I'm asking you in terms of environmental remediation. Does molecule size matter?
Molecular size does matter, yes.
Why?
Well, again, if you're looking from a fate and transport standpoint, and again, just maybe to clarify to the commission, my specialty is groundwater. That's where I spend a lot of my time, my profession. So soil and groundwater. So a lot of my examples may come from that, and maybe a lot of groundwater discussion. So if you're an air fan, I apologize. I'm going to use a lot of groundwater analogies here. But if you're talking about a large compound, so a large molecular size or molecular weight, those compounds are going to be likely more hydrophobic. So in the case of a PFAS molecule, it'll likely be that hydrophobic tail, right? So as we tack on and you add those Lego blocks, as they get bigger, you're going to have a larger hydrophobic tail. That'll end up resulting in compounds that are more likely to sorb to soil or to organic material that is in the subsurface. They're also going to be less water soluble as a result. So as a result of being less water soluble, more hydrophobic, they won't move at all. In fact, some as large as those polymers likely won't go very far at all.
Okay, thank you. And I also heard you say that the PFAS weights are different in terms of an environmental remediation process. Why does that matter?
Yeah, from cleanup, it matters. And I think the simplest example would be very similar, just like the subsurface. If we're looking at a granular activated carbon filter, for example, which is what we use to treat water, it's a standard treatment system. Larger molecular weight compounds are going to get caught in that filter, whereas smaller ones may pass through. So molecular weight or molecular size plays a role. It's not the only role, but plays a role when it comes to designing, in this case, a filter, but any sort of treatment system.
I heard you say it matters in terms of cleanup. We've also heard testimony from other witnesses as well as members of the public this week that PFAS chemicals are forever. Are there ways to clean up PFAS?
Yes, there are.
Could you sort of explain some of those ways?
I'd be happy to, yeah. And I'd like to say, I'm not here to make a soundbite or anything, but I do understand from a stability standpoint, the reason why the term forever chemicals has come about. From an environmental engineering standpoint, they're not forever chemicals at all. There are ways to remove them from the environment, and there are ways to destroy them. And I do this on a routine basis. So, for example, the only catch with PFAS, and again, I think there has been a lot of discussion here, is that they do biodegrade. The poly sides degrade, as we talked about. They move to those terminal end products, which are all the PERs. But other than that, that's one of the big factors that separates PFAS from maybe others. Chlorinated solvents can degrade in the subsurface. We have aerobic bacteria that do a lot of work on petroleum hydrocarbons on our behalf. So that component, that biodegradation component, is limited when it comes to PFAS. Now, like I said, I want to repeat, poly will degrade, right, to per, but then you end up with those terminal products. In terms of just treatment itself, it starts with some of the simplest things. Just like I mentioned, granular activated carbon works very well for compounds like PFOA and PFAS, quite frankly. And so in my world, again, I do a lot of work in the non-polymer. Again, those are the ones that are the focus. Those are the regulated compounds. So when you look at the suite of non-polymer compounds, relatively PFOA and PFAS are considered longer chain compounds. So I know it's a little confusing because we talk about polymers being super long. Imagine polymers being super, super long, and then we're talking about this smaller group, and of that smaller group, there's some longer chains and some shorter chains. So if you look at granular activated carbon, for an example, it's very effective for PFAS in particular for removal, somewhat effective for PFOA, PFHXS as well. And then as you move down to the size of the molecular weight, the weight gets smaller, it becomes less effective. And so, we don't just throw our hands up in the air. We end up saying, okay, what are other options? And so there's ion exchange resins, which allow us to treat a broader suite of PFAS. You can go to reverse osmosis. These are technologies we use to clean our water already. So reverse osmosis, nanofiltration, but that only solves part of the problem. So we've now taken and again, we all agree that PFAS, the concentrations in the environment can be very low, which makes it very difficult as an environmental engineer to clean, can be very difficult to clean them up. So one solution is you concentrate. So in this case, let's say you would extract water, run it through a granular activated carbon system, or you'd run it through an ion exchange system. You'd then create a concentrate, which then can be used for destructive technologies. And destructive technologies in general will involve adding energy to the system. So things that I work on are plasma technologies, supercritical water oxidation. There's a whole host, senolysis. So these are technologies that sound kind of far-fetched, but they actually are commercially available today. And so in general, I don't want to get into each. I'd be happy to talk more plasma and senolysis and supercritical water oxidation. But the simple commonality between these technologies is that you're adding energy to the system. If you add energy, you can break that carbon-fluorine bond. Once you break that fluorine bond, then you can start dealing with the parts of the compound. Okay, you break it up into little bits.
Thank you. And we've heard a lot about terminal products, and you mentioned terminal products just now. Can you treat terminal products with PFAS?
You can, yes, absolutely.
Madam Hearing Examiner, Officer, I would object to any further testimony or questions about this issue. There's nothing in Dr. Richardson's testimony about whether you can clean PFAS up or not. It's just irrelevant to this topic.
Actually, my understanding is that she directed his attention to some testimony by Dr. Hansen, and that's what he's rebutting. Am I correct?
That's exactly correct. I have directed him to testimony from Dr. Hansen that these chemicals are persistent and forever, and I'm having him address that specific question.
Please keep going.
Thank you. Dr. Richardson, did Dr. Hansen mention produced water in her direct and rebuttal testimony?
She did.
Okay. I'm going to scroll to page 12 of Dr. Hansen's direct testimony. On page 12, lines 8 through 12, Dr. Hansen states a peer-reviewed study, brackets, Zhang 2022, documented levels of several PFAS in produced water samples in the Permian Basin. Additionally, this study underscores the need to establish a comprehensive chemical characterization of PW, which is produced water, to better understand environmental and human risk, as well as plan for effective treatment of the PW, produced water, and associated wastes. Did I read that correctly?
You did.
Is this Zhang article in 2020 that says Zhang 2022, is that the same article that Dr. Hansen cited in her rebuttal testimony?
Yes, it is.
Are you familiar with this article by the author Zhang?
I am.
Have you reviewed this article by the author Zhang?
I have.
Is this 2022 Zhang article the same article that Dr. Spear identified in his testimony as Guardian Exhibit 88 and called the Dr. Peju testimony?
It is.
From here on out, I'm going to call it the Zhang article, if that's okay.
That's how I know it. So thank you.
Okay. Dr. Richardson, did the authors of the Zhang article set out to examine PFAS?
They did not.
Okay. Do you recall what were the authors of that article actually examining?
They were just looking at produced water quality and looking at ways, again, using that characterization information for possible beneficial reuse. That was listed in the first part of the paper.
Do you agree with Dr. Hansen's conclusion here that I've displayed, that the Zhang article supports a finding that there is PFAS in produced water?
I don't agree.
If you'll give me just one moment, please. What I have pulled up here on the screen is New Energy Economy Exhibit KH-4, which is included in the rebuttal testimony of Dr. Hansen and is the Zhang article. Is this the Zhang article that you reviewed before Dr. Hansen, or excuse me, Dr. Richardson?
It is.
Okay. Could you explain what it is that we're looking at here in table 4?
Sure. And I do know that there's been a lot of tension on this paper, so I'd be happy to kind of walk through these results. So what we're looking at on the left-hand side is the list of PFAS going from PFBS all the way down the list. And I would point out that this is from one sample, right? So this is from PWNM-SWD. And I will also point out that the sample was taken not from a wellhead or any part of the actual well pad. It was taken from a saltwater disposal facility. So the back end of a saltwater disposal facility, back end of the tank battery, to be exact. Again, that if it's a saltwater disposal facility, it's likely that there are produced water going there. So I want to point out that this is not a wellhead sample. The second part to point out is that they show two types of results. So the next column over is PW representing the produced water sample, or in this case, the saltwater disposal sample, and then the Pecos River sample that was taken as well. The next column over is the method detection limit, and then the reporting limit. And that's for the produced water sample. And then next column over is for the Pecos MDL and RL. So before I kind of dive into the results, I think it's probably worth just explaining method detection limit and reporting limit. So method detection limit is really a calculated value. It's the lowest statistically calculated value that you can get that's above noise. So I think there's a lot of discussion about chromatograms at this hearing. There's always going to be this rumbling at the bottom of a chromatogram, and that's the noise. And so the method detection limit is going to be above that noise, sort of separate itself. But then there's also a reporting limit, which is usually, it can be an order of magnitude higher. It can be 3 standard deviations. Essentially, that is representing the uncertainty between the bottom end of the calibration range. So when we make a calibration curve, we would get, in this case, let's say a standard for PFBS. We would make in this case, maybe it would be a 1 PPT standard, a 5 PPT standard, and so on. You'd move up. And so you generate your calibration curve, that's your linear range. So anything that is within that linear range would be a result with no qualifier, depending on whether there may be a qualifier, but it wouldn't be one of these that we're listing here. Anything that is between the method detection limit and the reporting limit, which again is that last data point on the linear range, has a J flag. So, I'll just go through this. So the J flag is essentially an estimated value. And it's a value that, again, we see time and time again in the environmental field. When concentrations are close to your detection limit, we have J flag values. These are not values that we throw away. We don't toss them, right? We simply say, let's take them with a grain of salt, okay? That they are outside of the linear calibration range for that method. In this case, they also have another qualifier, which is a B, and that refers to the blank. So there's a method blank that is run through the instrumentation. And in this case, if there's a B, it means that that compound was detected in the blank. When you have a situation where a compound is detected in the blank, you do throw that data out. That means that there's some interference. And in this case, if there had been a blank detected in the linear range, you actually would throw the whole data set out. But because this is in the uncertainty range, a lot of the other data can stay. The other part now, so now that we've kind of talked about what all the components are, we can kind of get into the results. And so if you draw your attention to that first column, we see detections or results for PFBS, PFBA, PFHXS, NET FOS, and then PFTEA on the other side of the table. All of those results are J-flagged, which means they're estimated, so they're off the linear range. And 2 had blanks or that compound detected in the blank. So the take home here is that they're detecting estimated values for PFBS, NET FOSE, and then PFTEA at very, very low levels. And I got to point out, these are extremely low levels that we're dealing with in this paper. Most of the analytical labs commercial labs that we use, the detection limits are not this low. So this would be a university lab.
So are there any results in this table that reliably show PFAS in produced water?
I don't think so. I mean, at the end of the day, they don't. If you're dealing with simply a bunch of, and again, the other point we didn't make is that there are non-detects for the majority of the compounds. So that means they're below the method detection limit. So at the end of the day, no, these are not reliable results, because the only results that are left behind are these estimated very small concentration results.
Okay. So then let me ask you this, Dr. Richardson, would it be scientifically reasonable to rely on this data to demonstrate that there is PFAS in produced water?
It would not.
Would most experts in your field rely on the statements in this table to conclude that there are PFAS in the produced water?
Objection to that question. Calls for an answer that he can't give.
Can you lay a foundation for it?
I believe that I have laid a foundation for it. I've asked him about the results. I've asked him to explain the results. I've asked him to explain what the results mean. I've also asked him if there's a reasonable scientific basis to rely on these results. And as an expert in that field, he can opine on whether experts in his field would rely on these results.
Okay, go ahead.
I would object again. He calls for a hearsay answer that there's no way that he could know what other experts think of this study.
I'm not asking what other experts think. I'm asking whether experts in his field would rely on this, which is one of the qualifications to have expert data in court and would be admissible in court.
and how he would know that. Yeah, go ahead.
Would you mind repeating that one more time?
Sure. No problem. Would experts in your field, Dr. Richardson, rely on the statements in this table to conclude that there are PFAS in produced water?
They would not.
Would you rely on these statements to conclude the statements in this table to conclude that there's PFAS in produced water?
I would not.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. I'm now going to switch topics a little bit, and I want to talk about.
Hold on one sec. Is this a good time for a break? It's been an hour 45.
Sure, that's fine with me.
Okay, let's break then until 3, and we'll come back and finish your questioning. Thank you. I'm off in more ways than one. Let's come back from the break, please.
Mine's green.
Okay.
If you would resume your questioning of Dr. Richardson for his rebuttal testimony, Ms. Mulcahy.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. Dr. Richardson, just before we broke, I had mentioned that I wanted to transition to speaking with you about FRAC focus disclosures and the public access to those disclosures. There was much testimony this week about the FRAC focus chemical registry. Dr. Richardson, did you hear that testimony this week about FRAC focus?
I did. I was here Wednesday onwards.
Thank you. Dr. Richardson, are you familiar with the mandated FRAC focus disclosures in New Mexico?
I am.
Are the disclosures that operators submit to FRAC focus available, for New Mexico? Are the disclosures that operators submit to FRAC focus available to the public?
They are.
Do you know, is there a charge for those disclosures to the public?
There's no charge.
Earlier this week, Dr. Brown provided rebuttal testimony on behalf of guardians. In his testimony, Dr. Brown testified that to the effect that everything that goes down a well must come back up a well. And that if something like a chemical were to go down a well and be released, then it's going to come back up the well and also be on the surface or be in the air. Would you say, Dr. Richardson, is it accurate to state that everything that goes down a well comes back up a well?
That's not accurate.
Why is it not accurate, Dr. Richardson?
Well, when you are performing hydraulic fracturing, you're obviously putting an immense amount of water down, and this is a typical frac can be anywhere from 1 million to 10 million gallons of water based on the frac disclosures I was looking at for New Mexico. In my experience with fracking in other states as well, it depends on the geology, right? So there's certain areas where if you frac, water you'll go down along with any additives. And in many cases, the same amount of water does not come back up, right? So, and some of that water is retained in the porous matrix of the target zone. And often those target zones, some are very wet and some can actually be very dry. So you actually do get some retention of water and potentially additives as well in the subsurface.
And so, again, talking about testimony from Dr. Brown, he had testified to the effect that one thing the general public might do with fully disclosed chemical lists is conduct their own baseline testing for private drinking water wells. Are you familiar with the process of testing residential or private drinking water wells for chemicals?
I am.
How about for PFAS?
I am.
Could you discuss your experiences with that?
Yeah, and I could just start with just the general chemicals. So sampling a residential or a private water well is actually pretty complicated. It's not as simple as just filling up a jar and then submitting to a lab. I did a fair amount of work in Pennsylvania to spend a lot of time in people's basements. It's very nice people. And ended up sampling their residential water wells for a study that was funded by the Department of Energy. And we were looking at the ways to sample for methane in shallow aquifers, right? So what's the best way to do that and for a residential water well? So just to make it clear, a residential water well is not designed for being a monitoring well, right? Obviously, its design is to collect as much water as you can for that resident. It's about quantity, right? So its screen's going to be very large, or pretty long. It's going to be fairly wide. It's going to have a big pump in the center. And then it's going to be attached to a whole host of equipment, pressure tank. Some people would have softeners and so on. So in terms of trying to get a representative sample, it can be fairly complicated. And again, it's not like sampling from a monitoring well, which what we do is we have low flow sampling equipment. We sample from a particular interval in that screen. The screens for a monitoring well are very short, very tight, maybe no more than 10 feet, so that you can actually get an environmental sample from the area that you're interested in. And so just in terms of complicating factors, one is where do you take a sample that is representative, that has the least impact, so to speak, or influence? You're also sampling from a pump, the pump that is designed to pull as much water as it can up to the resident. So you're not doing any low flow sampling. You're creating some turbulence in that water, which can affect results as well. So those are a couple of complications. Now you bring PFAS into the mix, and we know that PFAS are in our homes, right? They're our apparel, our foodware, pans, that type of thing. It's endless, right? The number of consumer products that are there. And so you worry about cross-contamination. And so that's, again, an issue that we deal with in the environmental field, just sampling water wells. We have very strict procedures for sampling for PFAS. You have to have certain containers to collect that water sample. You have to collect that water sample in a certain way. You have to wear the appropriate material that is not going to cause any cross-contamination. So those are a few of the issues that you run into, not only just sampling for PFAS, but sampling from a residential water well or a private water well.
Thank you. Along those lines, earlier this week, Mr. Horowitz, on behalf of Guardians, suggested that broader disclosures of chemicals, including PFAS, should be required by the commission so that the public, again, can conduct its own sampling if it wanted to, including on PFAS. In your experience, Dr. Richardson, would a member of the public know how to conduct its own groundwater sampling for PFAS?
I'll say in general, no, right? There always can be an environmental engineer like myself who potentially could do it, but by and large, no.
Would the general public know how to do surface water sampling for PFAS?
Again, in general, no.
And when you say in general, no, why are you qualifying with?
I'm only qualifying just because I'm a homeowner and I could sample my well. So that's really the qualifying statement.
Okay. Mr. Horowitz, in his rebuttal testimony, also stated that PFAS have useful properties. That's why they've been used historically. Do you agree with that statement?
PFAS do have useful properties, yes.
What might some of those useful properties be?
Well, we've discussed them, a little bit at the hearing. I mean, again, they are thermally stable compounds. They have some surfactant properties depending on the particular PFAS you're interested in. So those are the main properties that really have driven the use of PFAS in whether it be industry or whether it be our commercial applications and so on. So again, thermal stability would be one, and then surfactant properties as well.
Dr. Richardson, you heard Dr. Anderson's testimony earlier today, correct?
I did.
And we were talking about the different PFAS out there. And she said it was her opinion that not all PFAS are toxic. Would you agree with that opinion?
I would agree.
Why might have these certain PFAS that you mentioned have been previously used in hydraulic fracturing?
So the two that I'd mentioned from the Frac Focus database, and again, I'm I'll caveat, I'm not the manufacturer of these chemicals, but again, based on the information we've got on frac focus, they're typically used for friction reduction. And so what I do know from hydraulic fracturing is that you're dealing with high pressures, and you're looking to reduce friction when you are basically putting fluids in the subsurface. By reducing friction, you are increasing or reducing the strain on pumps, and you can also increase basically your recovery. So there's some efficiencies there by adding these types of additives as friction reducers.
Dr. Richardson, did you review the Physicians for Social Responsibility report for New Mexico that Mr. Horowitz co-authored?
I did.
Okay. And what was your, what did your review, in your review, what did you find of that report?
They had again, we didn't have exact results. I've put my results in my direct testimony, but with respect to PTFE and FPEG, we did see very similar results. And in fact, we tried very hard to match what PSR had done in their report. And they were very good about putting out how they laid out and how they did the data analysis.
And you said that you largely agreed with those results. Could you explain what those results were?
Again, it'd be helpful to have my direct testimony out. But again, in terms of, I think it was around 9,000 records we looked at between the time frame of 2013 to 2022, which we tried to match again with the PSR report, and ended up somewhere in the neighborhood about 2% of those records had PTFE reported. And then the other take home that came from the PTFE side was that it was not reported in frac focus after 2020, if I'm not mistaken.
Madam Hearing Officer, I don't believe this is rebuttal. This is just what is in Dr. Richardson's direct testimony. And so I've let it go for a little while, and I just think that we are running out of time. It's 3:15, and I just, out of respect for all of us, I would like to ask that you instruct Nemoga's counsel to not repeat Dr. Richardson's direct.
Thank you, Ms. Nanasi. So yes, absolutely, Ms. Mulcahy. It is 3:15. We do have to stop at 4:30. We already have a dozen people signed up for public comment, and the commissioners are just not available after 5 today. So we're going to have to shoot into the future for another hearing day if we don't finish. Okay. So if you could draw that line, that'd be great.
Sure, absolutely, no problem. And Mr. Horowitz Mr. Horowitz and Dr. Brown were in their testimony this week were unable to provide any examples of direct evidence in New Mexico that PFAS associated with oil and gas operations resulted in environmental contamination. Are you aware of any such evidence?
I'm not.
Okay. Did you review Dr. Spears' testimony?
I did.
Okay. I am going to share this. I have pulled up Dr. Spears' testimony. What I have pulled up here on the screen is Dr. Spears' testimony, which is Guardians Exhibit 79, page 3, line 19. He says, because PFOS and PFOA come in so many different chemical forms. Do you agree with Dr. Spears that PFOS and PFOA come in many different forms?
I'm going to have to object to that. I know we had a chemistry lesson this morning, but I have not objected yet to non-chemists testifying on chemistry, so I'm going to finally object.
Great, thank you. Ms. Mulcahy?
So I would say a few things in response to that. Dr. Richardson is not a chemist, but he is an expert in the field of environmental engineering. He has already testified that he regularly works with PFAS remediation. And in order to remediate PFAS, you have to understand the chemistry of it. And second of all, he works with experts. And as an expert, he's able to independently identify whether or not this is reliable information because he works with chemists.
Okay, that seems a little attenuated. Perhaps explore with him what he needs to know in order to do the remediation. I know he's already mentioned that he does.
Sure. Dr. Richardson, have you ever worked on remediation of PFOS or PFOA?
I have.
Would you say you are familiar with the various different chemical aspects of PFOS or PFOA?
I am.
Okay. Dr. Richardson, how many different forms does PFOS and PFOA come in?
There's one form for each.
I'm sorry, could you say that again? I missed that.
There's one form. So there's a PFOA, a PFOA is one molecule, and PFOS is another molecule.
Are you aware if PFOS has ever been used in hydraulic fracturing operations?
I'm not aware of that.
Are you aware if PFOA has ever been used in hydraulic fracturing operations?
I'm not aware.
Ms. Mulcahy, I'm just going to interrupt, Madam Hearing Officer. The pounding that we hear is art is being installed in the building. So we apologize.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We you just moments ago and also previously talked about your experience in environmental remediation related to PFAS in soil, water, and wastewater. And you testified that you're aware that the division has actually strike that. Strike that. Okay. Earlier this week, Dr. Brown testified that there was no way to test for PFOA, and PFOS compounds in the environment. Is that correct?
I'm going to object. I do not recall that being Dr. Brown's testimony.
Ms. Mulcahy?
If that was Dr. Brown's testimony, Dr. Richardson, would that be correct?
We can test for PFOA and PFOA and PFOS.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to move on to page 4 of Dr. Brown's, Dr. Spear's testimony, lines 1 through 7 here, where Dr. Spear is talking about the subsurface. And he calls it, quote, a hole of the unknown. Do you agree with that statement, Dr. Richardson?
I don't.
Why don't you agree with it?
I mean, I certainly agree that there's a lot we don't know about the subsurface, particularly at 10,000 feet. I agree with that. However, we do know a lot as well. We know a lot about the type of geology. We know a lot about the porous matrix. We know about the wettability. And I know that Dr. Spears's expertise is more in the microbiology, so I would leave that to him. He's probably right that there's not a lot that's known about the bacteria that live down in that environment. But in terms of the actual geology, lithology, and all the layers as we go down from surface to that type of depth, we have a very good handle on. We actually can pull samples out from the subsurface and understand the geology, lithology, grain size, moisture content, a lot of good, important things.
Is it important for environmental remediation to understand those things?
Absolutely.
I'm going to stay on page 4, but just scroll down to lines 8 through 19. In this portion of his testimony here, Dr. Spear says, quote, subsurface separation of aquifers is near impossible in the oil and gas industry over longer timeframes. Do you agree with Dr. Spear?
I don't agree.
Why don't you agree?
I mean, we have, again, what I think he's referring to is either natural or seismic connections between fracks and the surface. I don't know of any documentation of a fracture extending from fracture target zone to a shallow aquifer. So if that's what he's referring to, I'm not aware of those types of things. So in terms of the connection, I don't see that.
In your experience, have you ever seen that?
No.
Okay. Going to. In this same portion of his testimony, Dr. Spear states, we do not know what is really happening in the deep subsurface with the metric ton amounts of mass of PTFE or other trade secreted compounds being deposited by O&G operations in New Mexico. Do you agree with that statement?
Would you mind just scrolling it?
Sorry. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I mean, I disagree. Yeah.
Why do you disagree?
Same deal. We don't know what's happening in the deep subsurface. We have a very good handle of what's happening. We know a fair amount about the properties of the subsurface. We know the volumes that are coming back up from hydraulic fracturing. So there's a lot of information that we do know. And if he's referring to hydraulic fracturing itself.
Staying on this page and then scrolling onto the next page. Dr. Spear states, the O&G industry would also have you believe that a near surface aquifer for drinking water is not impacted by deeper O&G operations and contaminations. The O&G industry is making a deep subsurface minestrone of compounds that could become more dilute and still dangerous minestrone across a wider area when and if subsurface connections happen, and they do happen. Do you agree with this statement, Dr. Richardson?
No, I mean, I will say that there are instances of well integrity events. So we do have to put that out there, that there's well casing issues or there's typically cementing issues. Those are fairly rare, as we had Mr. Powell discuss. But in terms of the overarching understanding of the subsurface, we have a pretty good handle on that.
Dr. Richardson, what happens if a chemical constituent becomes more dilute, as Dr. Spear mentions?
I mean, if something becomes more dilute, and again, this is again in relation with my colleague, Dr. Anderson, but typically a more dilute compound would be less toxic.
Are well integrity events regular events?
They are not.
In your professional experience, how frequent are well integrity events?
I would defer to Mr. Powell's testimony yesterday, which I believe he said the max was one a year. And at least in the research that I have, I think it's even smaller, but I would defer to Mr. Powell, who's Deputy Director of OCD.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to scroll to page 8, line 22. Dr. Spear states, the fate and transport can happen within a specific compartment of the earth or mixed between compartments, such as air and water. Because there is a huge variety of kinds of PFAS molecules, migration within/between compartments is wide-ranging, dependent upon the different physical and chemical characteristics that affect a particular molecule's behavior and thus ultimate fate. Do you agree with that statement, Dr. Richardson?
I mean, there are components. There's a huge variety of kinds of PFAS, I would agree with. And then different physical and chemical characteristics that affect the molecule's behavior and thus ultimate fate. So, I mean, that's the majority of the sentence. The migration between compartments is wide ranging. I'm not quite sure what he's referring to, but if he's talking about mobility in the subsurface with respect to the PFAS, the variety of different PFAS, then yes, the mobility would be very different between compartments in the subsurface.
From the environmental remediation perspective, why does mobility matter in this context?
Well, mobility matters again because we can figure out where, and Dr. Anderson mentioned this as well, the exposure pathway and understanding how a contaminant goes from A to B. And so if a compound is mobile, then you would look at ways to clean up and basically break that exposure pathway, right? So you would look for technologies that you could use to basically prevent that contaminant from moving from A to B or to that receptor. And when I say a receptor, I mean like a homeowner or a residential, not Dr. Anderson's receptor, which was within the human body.
I'm going to scroll to page 13 on Dr. Spear's testimony, and I apologize again about the anybody in the room motion sick. On page 13 through 14, lines 20 on page 13 through lines 3 on page 14, Dr. Spear says there are hundreds to thousands of different PFAS compounds, and generally they, and then he goes on to 14, say, can move through soils and contaminate water resources, bioaccumulate, and biomagnify across food webs. Do you agree with Dr. Spear that hundreds and thousands of PFAS move through soils and contaminate water sources?
I do not.
Why don't you agree with that?
Again, various sizes of PFAS molecules, again, they come in all shapes and sizes and have different chemical features, and as a result will behave very differently in the subsurface. Some will actually sorb to organic material in the subsurface and be retained, and others will be more mobile, more water soluble.
Madam Hearing Officer, sorry to interrupt. I'm seeing the clock now, and of course, NMOGA should be able to make their case, but I do want to point out that we have limited time. And I do want to make sure that if we are going to conclude today that Wild Earth Guardians has an opportunity to cross-examine this witness, we pre-filed our rebuttal to try and avoid any excess time going through the testimony. So, I point that out only to say that it's in the interest of fairness, I just want to make sure that we have some time with this witness.
Will you estimate the remainder of your questions, please?
I have 2 questions left.
All right, terrific. Go ahead.
I'm looking here on Dr. Spear's testimony, page 14, lines 12 through 14, where he says PFAS compounds PFAS compounds also likely sorb to subsurface minerals and stay in the subsurface, making them hard, if not impossible, to remove via chemical and/or pump and treat schemes. Do you agree with this statement, Dr. Richardson?
I do not.
Why not?
PFAS compounds do sorb. That part of the statement is true, and can stay in the subsurface. As I mentioned, certain compounds, PFAS being one that is more likely to sorb to the subsurface to organic material.
When you say PFAS, are you saying PFOS?
PFOS. Thank you. But saying making it harder, if not possible, to remove by chemical or pump and treat systems is incorrect. That pump and treat systems can remove compounds by changing the concentration gradient in the subsurface. And then there are chemicals that can be added to remove a PFAS or strip from soil. So, but in general, pump and treat systems can pull, some compounds off of organic material, again, as you change the concentration gradient.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. After listening to this week's testimonies and reading various different direct and rebuttal testimonies, is there anything you think would be beneficial for you to rebut here that I have not asked you about?
No.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson.
Thank you.
I yield the witness for cross.
Thank you, Ms. Mulcahy. Mr. Davis?
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. Hello, bless you. Hello, Mr. Richardson, Dr. Richardson, sorry. My name is Tim Davis. I represent the petitioner Wild Earth Guardians. You spoke at length about cleanup just now in rebuttal. Do you agree that prior to cleanup, PFAS poses a threat to human health and the environment?
Not all PFAS would cause a risk to health and human, what you said, the health and human environment, the environment and human health, excuse me. Thank you.
Do you agree that for the 6 PFAS compounds for which we have toxicological data, the ones that have been regulated by the EPA under drinking water standards, that prior to cleanup, that those 6 PFAS in the environment pose a threat to public health and the environment?
I mean, I would say potentially when you say risk, you end up talking about exposure pathway. So there's a toxicity, but there's also exposure. But in the end, there are regulated compounds. And from an environmental engineering standpoint, my goal is to treat regulated compounds.
Is it fair to call them contaminants?
They are contaminants.
Well, prior to cleanup, do you agree that they could contaminate the environment?
To varying degrees, because they're different compounds.
Is that a yes?
Yeah, it's a yes.
Did you hear Dr. Brown suggest that members of the public would put their own well water in a jar for the purposes of testing?
I did not hear that.
Did Dr. Brown say how water well testing should be conducted?
I don't recall him saying that either.
Does the proposed rule prohibit members of the public from hiring someone with your qualifications to conduct water well testing?
It doesn't, and I would just say I would like them to call me as an environmental engineer. I mean, absolutely would like them to call the right people.
Do you believe that whether intentionally added or not, we should prevent the injection of PFAS into the subsurface?
It's very broad. I mean, from an environmental standpoint, I'm here again, as we mentioned, that the whole point of this hearing is to remove PFAS from the environment or ban PFAS. And so based on whatever definition you're picking, whatever party you are in this hearing, that's what we're achieving. So as an environmental engineer, I'm trying to remove PFAS from the environment. So yes.
Do you agree that continued use of PFAS in any industry would increase the likelihood that PFAS could contaminate the environment?
I can't speak for all industries, but at the end of the day, majority of industries are moving away from PFAS that were once using them. I mean, that you can't even, for the regulated compounds, they're not even being manufactured. So in the order of trying to go ahead and continue to do what you're doing, it's just not going to work. So, I see what you're saying, Mr. Davis. Like, you're asking, could you repeat that one more time just to make sure I got it right?
Sure. Do you believe that whether intentionally added or not, we should prevent the injection of PFAS compounds into the subsurface?
I think in this respect, I think intentionally added does matter for this particular hearing. But if you talk about PFAS as a whole, I mean, my goal is to remove PFAS from the environment.
Would it be easier to just ban it in the first place?
That is the goal of this hearing. We currently are banning PFAS.
If you ban it in the first place, you presumably wouldn't have to remove it from the environment.
If you ban it, I'll still be cleaning. There's still going to be residual PFAS to deal with. But yes, if you ban a compound, it's no longer used. then you will not see it. Its use in the environment will be less. That's correct.
Are you aware that the New Mexico Oil Conservation Division does not verify trade secret claims?
I don't know anything about trade secrets. I don't know anything about trade secrets, Mr. Davis.
Did you hear testimony to that effect this week?
I did, but I can't say that I really understand the trade secret laws in New Mexico.
I want to look at your direct testimony on page 3. And I'm going to read part of that testimony. You can tell me if it's accurate. Despite some limited historical use of PFAS in hydraulic fracturing operations, the oil and gas industry has since transitioned away from these compounds in favor of other non-PFAS containing chemistries, as evident by the data provided in Frac Focus. Is that accurate?
Based on my discussions with NMOGA representatives, it is. And also, again, from the data that we see in Frac Focus, that not being disclosed beyond, so PTFE, for an example, beyond 2020, we don't see it in the database.
NMOGA told you that the oil and gas industry has transitioned away from PFAS use?
Individual, not NMOGA, the organization, individual organizations themselves I've had side conversations with.
And you're basing your testimony on what someone from NMOGA told you?
I think I'm going to object to that. He didn't. He just clarified that he had individual conversations with organizations, and that's what he was basing it on.
Okay, he can state that then if that, because it was not clear, it was ambiguous. Go ahead, Dr. Richardson.
Mr. Davis, would you like me to repeat that again? I had individual conversations with organizations.
So my question was whether the statement in your testimony that the oil and gas industry has since transitioned away from these compounds in favor of other non-PFAS containing chemistries was based on a conversation that you had with a representative from NMOGA.
It's not entirely. I said by the data provided in Frac Focus.
So you independently verified that statement from your testimony by researching Frac Focus?
I looked at Frac Focus and looked at the absence of these compounds that were previously disclosed.
And based on the absence of disclosure of these compounds, you state that the oil and gas industry has transitioned away from those compounds.
It's a component of that argument, yes.
Can you guarantee that there are no companies using PFAS containing chemistries?
I cannot.
Why can you not do that?
I don't have that information in front of me.
You don't have that information in front of you, or you don't have that information available to you in Frac Focus?
I mean, you could say that I don't have that available in front, excuse me, I don't have that available in Frac Focus or any other documentation.
And the reason that it's not available in Frac Focus is because there is no requirement for full chemical disclosure in New Mexico?
Again, when you start moving into trade secret, I don't have a whole lot to comment on that.
You have looked at Frac Focus disclosures?
I've looked at the Frac Focus disclosures.
Are you familiar with the column in Frac Focus disclosures for the CAS numbers?
I am.
Are you familiar that sometimes in that column, a chemical is listed as, quote, proprietary?
Correct.
Therefore, there's no CAS number for some of the entries in Frac Focus?
That is correct.
So then it is impossible to know all of the chemicals that are being used downhole in New Mexico?
It is impossible. You would not know. Yes, that's correct. Those that are trade secreted, you would not know.
So how do you know that oil and gas companies have since transitioned away from using PFAS compounds in New Mexico?
Again, based on Frac Focus and based on conversations with organizations part of NMOGA.
So you cannot guarantee that
Objection.
PFAS.
Asked and answered.
Right, he already said no.
I'll leave it there. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Richardson.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Ms. Manassi?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Richardson.
Good afternoon, Ms.
I want to
Manassi.
pick up just where Mr. Davis left off.
Okay.
What are the organizations? Who are the organizations
Who are
that
the
you spoke
organizations?
that you spoke with?
I don't think I'm at liberty to say.
Why not?
These were all conversations that I had as part of discussions with in the MOGA meetings.
With individual oil and gas companies?
Individuals from oil and gas companies.
And you are refusing to reveal who those are?
I don't think I'm at liberty to reveal that.
I'm going to object on the grounds of attorney-client privilege.
Right. Ms. Nanasi, I don't know of any disclosure rule that would require the witness to disclose the names of the representatives or the NMOGA member identity from those meetings.
Madam Hearing Officer, are you saying that I can't probe who he's spoken with that led him to say that the oil and gas industry has since transitioned away from using PFAS compounds? We have no idea who was there. And if there was anybody who was not a lawyer present in that room, then it's not attorney-client. So what is the basis for not being able to probe that?
Again, there's no rule that requires him to disclose it. The commission can give whatever weight they would like to his statement without further disclosure. He has said, I believe it was members of NMOGA or in NMOGA meetings. That's as much information as we have. Please move on.
Are you a vice president of GSI Environmental?
I am.
How long have you been with GSI Environmental?
It's been about 13 years.
As a vice president for GSI Environmental, you are responsible for the work product of GSI Environmental. Is that correct?
I am.
How many vice presidents are there at GSI Environmental?
I don't know that number off the top of my head, but it's greater than 10.
Is John Connor the president of GSI Environmental?
He is not.
Were you at GSI Environmental when John Connor was the president?
Objection.
Hold on. What was the question?
Were you at GSI Environmental when John Connor was the president of GSI Environmental?
And your objection is?
I'm objecting on a few things. First of all, it's outside the scope of either his direct or rebuttal testimonies. Second of all, I don't see anything in Dr. Richardson's CV, which is NMOGA Exhibit 1, that mentions anything about this individual, that he worked with him anywhere. I'm not sure what this line of question is even relevant to.
Are you heading for impeachment or something?
This is a foundational question to a document that I would like to show him. Yes.
Okay. Let's just go a little ways then. Go ahead.
Can you repeat the question, Ms. Nanasi?
Than's for saying my name.
And I'm
right?
presenting it right.
You did.
Saying it right. Thank you.
Were you at GSI Environmental when John Connor was a president of GSI Environmental?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, when he was the president, yes.
Okay. GSI Environmental was hired by California's Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board to study the potential health effects of irrigating food crops with oil and gas wastewater, correct?
Objection.
Where are you going, Ms. Nanasi?
I intend to, that's again another foundational question, but I want to know if he was part of the study. I want to show him an article about that.
Madam Hearing Officer, all of Dr. Richardson's publications are listed in his CV. This is not one of them listed anywhere in his CV. This is not even mentioned within the.
No, this is impeachment. Impeachment.
Direct or rebuttal.
Okay.
So I fail to see what it could impeach about his direct or rebuttal or anything in this exhibit.
All right, let's see if he was part of this article.
Not this article. I asked about a study.
The study. Thank you.
And if I can repeat the question, it was GSI Environmental was hired by California's Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board to study the potential health effects of irrigating food crops with oil and gas wastewater, correct? That's what I asked.
And he doesn't represent GSI Environmental. He's not here to answer everything on behalf of anything GSI Environmental has ever done.
I understand. Let's see if he was part of the study.
Mr. Nassi, was that your question? Was I part of that study?
No.
No, okay.
My
I'm
question
sorry
was,
again. I apologize.
GSI Environmental was hired by California's Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board to study the potential health effects of irrigating food crops with oil and gas wastewater, correct?
I do not know that.
Do you know that after GSI was hired,
Objection.
He's closed the door there, Ms. Tanasi. Please move on.
did GSI once list on their website that Chevron, ExxonMobil, and Occidental
Objection.
I haven't heard the rest of the question. Hold on.
Did GSI once list on its website Chevron, ExxonMobil, and Occidental Petroleum as clients, quote, we answer to?
Objection.
Okay, yes, the objection is sustained. Ms. Tanasi, I'm not sure I understand exactly why exploring all these things that GSI might have done or said or had on their webpage is an impeachment of Dr. Richardson, or even a potential impeachment of Dr. Richardson.
Well, if I could answer that, one of the issues here is who they answer to. Is it to the truth or is it to the oil and gas industry?
Okay.
Why is that not impeachment?
Because Dr. Richardson is not here in this hearing to answer for that company.
He said he was, though. He said that he's a vice president of GSI Environmental. He also said that he is responsible as a vice president for the work product of GSI Environmental.
He did not state that he's responsible for the work.
I
product
asked him
of
that very
GSI
question, and he
Environmental.
said he was.
He did say that he's here, that he works for GSI Environmental. That is certainly true. And all of his involvements are listed in NMOGA Exhibit D1. If she wants to ask about anything in that exhibit, that is fair game.
Right. So Dr. Richardson, do you understand the line we're trying to draw here? Certainly, I think testimony pertinent to this hearing and the decision before this commission on this rulemaking petition by the guardians, there may be something pertinent in there. At the same time, not everything that GSI has done or might do or might have as a client, for example, is going to be pertinent. So if you can answer with an eye to that line that we're trying to walk, I'd like to move on.
You are not a licensed professional engineer in New Mexico, are you?
I'm not.
How much are you getting paid for your testimony in this case?
Standard rate $3.50 an hour.
You are aware that PFAS and the diverse class of thousands of fluorinated substances have been used in New Mexico in oil and gas operations, correct?
No, that's not correct.
Isn't it your testimony that that you searched Frac Focus and found that PFAS compounds have been used in New Mexico?
Objection. She's mischaracterizing his testimony. He testified that 2 PFAS compounds have been found in New Mexico, not thousands or many PFAS.
Okay, would you rephrase, please, Nancy?
Do you know that PFAS and their diverse class of thousands of fluorinated substances have been used in New Mexico oil and gas operations?
I do not know that.
Have you spoken with or interviewed or reviewed documentation from any toxicologist, chemist, or engineer or any professional at EOG Resources about the PFAS or the diverse class of thousands of fluorinated substances EOG Resources has used in hydraulic fracturing in the Permian Basin?
I have not.
Have you spoken with or interviewed or reviewed documentation from any toxicologist, chemist, or engineer or any other professional at WPX?
Okay, I'm gonna object to this line of questioning. This wasn't in direct or rebuttal. I'm not sure how it's even relevant.
Where are you going, Ms. Vanassi?
Madam Hearing Officer, Dr. Richardson is testifying that he doesn't know now that there's been any PFAS that's been used in hydraulic fracturing. So I'm testing his knowledge. Like, who did he speak to find out about this?
Okay, instead of walking through a list of potential companies, oh, I see. Because when you ask who did he speak to, that was the meeting, right, with NMOGA members, that it's not being identified, or you're doing something else here?
I'm just asking in general.
Okay.
If he says that he doesn't know that the PFAS, now he's saying that he doesn't know that PFAS has been used in oil and gas in the Permian Basin. I'm asking, did you talk to the major players in oil and gas in the Permian Basin?
Okay, let's start with that question.
Okay, and I'm just gonna object. I'm sorry, I have to object here because he did not testify that none have been used. In fact, his testimony was that in his review of Frac Focus, he found that 2 had been used.
That's not what his testimony was. His testimony was he doesn't know. That's what he just said.
He testified to PTFE being used, and he said the full name out loud, but I'm just gonna call it FPEG.
Right. And so, Ms. Anassi, I think some of the confusion might be that your question didn't exactly track his earlier testimony about the 2 he found. You added something about hundreds or thousands of other PFAS substances. So I think that might be the cause of the confusion here. In any event, if we could just cut to the chase, and you can ask him if he talked with the major players here in the state.
Have you spoken with anyone from Chevron, ConocoPhillips, Cimarex, Matador Production Company, Marathon Oil, Mewbourne, Oxy, XTO, WPX about their use of PFAS in hydraulic fracturing in the Permian Basin?
No.
Have you conducted any independent analysis, review, documentation about the use of PFAS in Permian Basin in New Mexico or anywhere in New Mexico?
No.
In Colorado, do operators report the composition of the hydraulic fracturing fluid used during hydraulic fracturing operations to Frac Focus to state oil and gas regulators, or both?
Objection.
What's your objection?
Foundation. Foundation, but also it's outside the scope of both direct and rebuttal. And there's nothing in any of his testimonies about disclosures in Colorado.
Right. I think you do have to ask him how he knows that, or whether he knows that first.
Do you know if in Colorado, operators report the composition of the hydraulic fracturing fluid used during hydraulic fracturing operations to Frac Focus, to state oil and gas regulators, or both?
I don't.
And the same question for California. Do you know if in California, operators report the composition of the hydraulic fracturing fluid used during hydraulic fracturing operations to frac focus, to state oil and gas regulators, or both?
I do not.
You don't know.
I don't know.
Please tell the commission how many pounds of PFAS constitute 2.2% of hydraulic fracturing fluids.
To see where that is, would you mind if I took a look at if I have that in my written testimony? Is that there?
It's on, well, just on page 3, you said that that the use of PFAS in hydraulic fracturing operations in New Mexico is very limited, only 2.2% and 0.38% of the over 9,000 frac focus records between 2013 and 2023 referenced PTFE or FPEG respectively. And I'm asking you, how many pounds of PFAS constitute 2.2% of hydraulic fracturing fluids?
I believe my number was similar to what came out of the Physicians for Social Responsibility report. I think that was, I think it was 2,000 pounds, if I'm not mistaken, Ms. Nanasi. That's for PTFE.
Is it true that according to EPA, 1 tablespoon of PFOA would be enough to contaminate 1.75 trillion gallons of water, which is more than twice the total storage capacity of Elephant Butte Reservoir at 720 billion gallons, which forms New Mexico's largest lake on the Rio Grande River in the southwestern part of the state?
Objection. First of all, that's a compound question. Second of all, if Ms. Nancy wants to break that up, that might be an okay question. I also objection to the fact that I don't believe that Dr. Richardson mentioned anything about Elephant Butte Irrigation District or what she requested of him in his direct or rebuttal. So there's also no foundation for this.
Okay, I think, I don't know that it was a compound question. She was asking about whether a tablespoon would contaminate something the size of Elephant Butte, I think, right? I thought that was the question.
I think there's a foundational issue too, that Dr. Richardson didn't testify anything about Elephant Butte. I don't even know if he knows about Elephant Butte or what it is or how big it is.
I think she referred to someone else's testimony. If you would repeat the question, Ms. Nanasi, and Dr. Richardson, obviously, if you don't know the answer, you can say so.
Is it true, according to EPA, that 1 tablespoon of PFOA would be enough to contaminate 1.75 trillion gallons of water?
I don't know what reference you're referring to. I've not heard that.
2,000 pounds of PFAS that you said you believe is the equivalent of 2.2% of hydraulic fracturing fluids that have been released into New Mexico, correct?
That is over the time period of 2013 to 2022. And also from the respect of, in my experience, I focus on concentration. So yes, we are talking about 2,000 pounds, but we're also talking about billions and billions of gallons of water that were used. So if you look at a concentration side, it's a lot smaller. But it is if the question is how much was used over that time period, according to Frac Focus, what was disclosed, if that's what it is, 2,000 pounds, I believe that's what it was.
Has FPEG been voluntarily phased out of commerce?
I'm not 100% sure about that. I know that there's a zonal, I believe its trade name has been voluntarily zoned out or removed from commerce.
And was it removed from commerce because it was too toxic?
I don't know the reason why.
Has PTFE been voluntarily phased out of commerce?
Not that I'm aware of.
On page 7 of your testimony, you said that you're basically pushing back against the implication that PFAS are currently not being used in hydraulic fracturing operations in New Mexico. Is that right?
Can you point to me where we said that? I'm sorry, Ms. Nanasi. Is that towards the bottom of the?
Yes, I believe that the third line of the last bullet, it says PFAS are currently, you're talking about the PSR report, and then you're saying it's misleading because it implies that PFAS are currently being used in hydraulic fracturing operations, right?
Still trying to find it. My apologies. You said page 7?
Yeah, the last bullet.
Last bullet. Oh, okay. Yeah, so again, sorry, Ms. Nanasi, can you repeat it one more time?
So I'm just trying to first reference your testimony. So here you're pushing back against the implication that PFAS are not currently being used in hydraulic fracturing operations in New Mexico, correct?
I'm saying that it implies that PFAS are currently being used in hydraulic fracturing operations in New Mexico, which according to Frac Focus is not what I was able to see.
Okay, so that statement is based on what you reviewed in fact Frac Focus, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and you've already admitted that there are certain proprietary chemicals that are not revealed in Frac Focus and could be PFAS, right? Or other surfactants.
Objection. I think that mischaracterizes what he said about the Frac Focus disclosures.
Dr. Richardson, if it wasn't stated correctly, your testimony wasn't restated correctly, please correct it.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble following here. What? Please, can you repeat one more time, Ms. Nanasi?
The basis for your statement about that it's not currently being used, PFAS is not currently being used, is solely based on your review of Frac Focus, right?
It's based on my review of Frac Focus, correct.
And you've already admitted that some of the substances have been listed as proprietary, right?
Some of the substances are proprietary, correct.
And those substances could be PFAS or other surfactants, correct?
It is possible that they could be PFAS.
If PFAS are not being used by the oil and gas industry, why is NMOGA opposing a comprehensive PFAS ban?
Objection. That completely misstates NMOGA's position here. NMOGA is not comprehensively against a PFAS ban.
That wasn't my question. And that's not what I stated. I said, why is NMOGA opposing a comprehensive PFAS ban is what I said.
Right.
And I object to that characterization. NMOGA agrees that PFAS should be banned. It's merely a difference in definition, which Dr. Anderson explained those minute differences. So I think it's a mischaracterization of what is happening here.
So I think Ms. Nanasi is using the word comprehensive to refer to the broader definition that's in the petition. Is that correct, Ms. Nanasi?
It is.
All right. So Dr. Richardson, do you understand the question?
Hold on 1 second, please. We lost our quorum.
Okay, we don't need a quorum during a hearing, I didn't think. Because
it is part of an open. I do have a concern that without a quorum here, this was noticed as an open meeting.
But they appointed me to do the hearing and they all have committed to reviewing whatever part of the transcript,
That's true.
they miss.
Oh, he's back.
And here he's back anyway.
Okay.
All right, I'm sorry. Dr. Richardson, did you follow Ms. Manasseh's question about resisting a comprehensive ban, by which we understand to mean PFAS as defined more broadly in the petition than by NMOGA?
I'd appreciate her to just repeat it one more time.
If PFAS are not being used in New Mexico, why is NMOGA opposing a comprehensive PFAS ban?
It is my understanding that this is a comprehensive ban based on the definition that's proposed.
Is it NMOGA's position that trade secrets should trump public safety, public health, and the environment?
Objection. Dr. Richardson has stated multiple times he's not here to testify about trade secrets.
That's correct. Ms. Manasseh, would you move on?
NMOGA doesn't dispute the OCD information contained in Guardian's Exhibit number 92, which is the Oil Conservation Division's incident database, does it?
I don't know anything about that.
Did you review Melissa Troutman's testimony in this case?
I did not.
If OCD's rule is adopted, is it your understanding that operators would not be required to disclose all the chemical constituents used during downhole operations to frac focus or to state to oil and gas regulators or to state oil and gas regulators, except in the circumstance where there is what has been referred to here as a well integrity issue, and the OCD determines to use its enforcement power and require full chemical disclosure?
Gonna object on the compound question.
I'm not sure it was a compound question. Would you restate it, please?
If OCD's rule is adopted, is it your understanding that operators would not be required to disclose all the chemical constituents used during downhole operations to frac focus or to New Mexico oil and gas regulators, except in the circumstance where there is what has been referred to here as a well integrity issue and the OCD determines to use its enforcement power and require full chemical disclosure?
Ms. Nanasi, I'm going to respond with, what my understanding is that it's full disclosure to the OCD in the event of a well integrity event.
And that's only in the circumstance that OCD determines to use its enforcement power, correct?
I can't speak to that.
Okay, so you don't know. Is that your judgment?
I don't know.
Okay. But under no circumstance, if OCD's rule is adopted, will OCD be able to require full chemical disclosure for the thousands of oil and gas fluid related spill incidents or oil and gas produced water spill incidents? Would they?
I don't know about spills and again, could you repeat one more time? I'll make sure I understand you correctly, Ms. Nanasi.
Yes. So what I'm
just
trying to
gonna
distinguish.
object. I have to object here. Miss Nanasi is asking Dr. Richardson about OCD's position, which is inappropriate. If Miss Nanasi asks questions about OCD's position, the best person to ask is OCD. And additionally, Dr. Richardson has nothing in any of his testimony about the OCD's position.
Right. So, Ms. Nanasi, he did not speak about OCD's alternative rule amendments and requiring him at this point to have an opinion about them. I'm not going to go there. Would you estimate the remainder of your cross?
I don't have that many more questions, but I do want to ask him not about OCD's position. I'm asking about the OCD rule. He has in detail talked about the definitions, I mean, of the different rules and explains why. And so I think I can ask him, well, would it cover? Would OCD's rule cover full chemical disclosure in the instance of thousands of oil and gas related spills?
Okay.
He didn't testify at all about spills. This is not a rulemaking about spills.
Right.
In addition to what he did testify to regarding OCD, it was about how the OCD definition specifically of PFAS aligns with or is just slightly expanded on NMOGA's definition. He didn't talk about every other aspect of the OCD rule and what that might imply. That's just completely out of the scope.
Right. If you would, Ms. Nanasi, focus on the definition.
Did you talk about the OCD well integrity event and what would happen under this rule?
He did not talk about what would happen under a well integrity rule. He specifically testified about in the event of a well integrity event. He mentioned nothing else about well integrity events other than that.
Okay, let's have him say that. It might shortcut this a little if we just allow him to answer.
Your understanding of OCD rule, if it were adopted, OCD would not be able to require a full chemical disclosure in the circumstance of a oil and gas related spill incident, would it?
I do not know that.
Have you ever provided expert testimony for a public health organization or a nonprofit environmental organization?
I have not.
No further questions.
All right, thank you. Mr. Tremaine, do you have questions of Dr. Richardson?
I have just a couple questions. I'll try to be quick. Good afternoon, Dr. Richardson. My name is Jesse Tremaine. I'm the OCD Legal Director. I want to jump back to table 4, the table 4, not actually go to it, just reference if do you recall the content of table 4 generally.
Is that the Zhang paper that you're
Yes.
referring to? Yes.
And I just want you talked in some detail about the testing and the noise and the testing levels. I just want to ask you the compounds listed in table 4. If someone were to test for PFAS using any of these standardized methods that we've discussed that are included in OCD's proposed definition, would it detect the compounds in this table?
The answer is most. I will say that the F53B major and F53B minor, I'm not sure what those are, but all the rest would be detected.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Richardson. A quick question about your review of FRAC Focus. Are you able to identify PFAS or potential PFAS if you apply either NMOGA's proposed definition or OCD's proposed definition based on the content currently available to the public on the FRAC Focus website?
You can search for individual compounds, yes.
Okay. So if you see a chemical listed as a proprietary chemical on the FRAC Focus website, are you able to make an informed determination as to whether that may be a PFAS compound?
Not necessarily the trade secret. What you can do is the use. I think the use is provided.
Thank you. I want to ask you just a couple of clarifying questions because you spoke with Ms. Mulcahy about hydraulic fracturing generally. Dr. Richardson, are you generally familiar with the hydraulic fracturing process?
I am.
Okay. And when an operator or a well operator fracks a well the first time, do you know who does it?
I don't.
Okay. Okay. We've talked about chemical additives throughout the course of the hearing. If an operator or a contractor of an operator were to frack a well using a chemical additive, do you have any understanding or knowledge of how that operator would have obtained the chemical additive?
The additive typically comes from the manufacturer, as far as I understand.
Okay. No further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Tremaine. EOG doesn't have questions. Mr. Maxwell, do you have questions of Dr. Richardson?
I do not have questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Any redirect before I go to the commission?
I just have two quick ones. I will be quick. Dr. Richardson, you just stated to Mr. Tremaine that based on the use column, so we're talking about frac focus, based on the use column in frac focus, you could determine if the proprietary chemical is PFAS or not. Could you just explain that?
No, that's not correct.
Okay.
You know that you can determine what the use of the additive was. So whether it was a friction reducer or surfactant or some other term.
Okay. And just because a chemical is proprietary in frac focus, does that mean it's a PFAS?
No.
And lastly, does NMOGA support a ban on PFAS in oil and gas operations?
They do.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Mulcahy. Commissioner Bloom, do you have questions of Dr. Richardson?
Dr. Richardson, thank you for your time today. No questions.
Thank you.
Commissioner Ampoma. Oh, so it's 4:17. If you will ask your questions, that would be great. If we have a few minutes, we'll take just a very short break before public comment, because public comment's at 4:30, but we can push it a little bit if you have a lot of questions. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Richardson, for your testimony. And I do appreciate you talking about the treatment options for PFAS. I really appreciated that. Now, I want to know, what is the current research status in determining the source of PFAS in underground source of drinking water?
Would you mind repeat that again, Commissioner? And my apologies.
Okay. What is the current research status, yes, in determining the source of PFAS in, let's say, shallow or surface water?
Yeah, that's a good question, and very difficult to determine. So the way that can be done is you can look at signatures, so ratios of different PFAS. So, for example, let's just say an AFFF source, for example, whether it be a particular product, will have a certain PFAS character, right? PFAS signature. And so you can look for that in the environment, and perhaps that gives you a little bit more information about the source. So it's a looking at the ratios, all those compounds that we looked at in table 4, it'd be looking at certain ratios of those compounds in the environment, so that you can kind of tie that back. Again, it's not definitive, but it certainly gives you clues. The other would be looking at variation in concentration, so or variations in types of PFAS. So you see a lot of shorter chain versus longer chain, or the ratio of longer chain to shorter chain can give you clues on the types of PFAS sources there might be, because there can be variations in PFAS signatures, whether it be a consumer product source or whether it be a AFFF.
So then, as research evolves, there's still a possibility to more or less be able to know the source of PFAS and more or less negating the ambiguity with regards to intentional PFAS.
Well, I would like to say we're moving in that direction, but I would like to kind of temper our expectations a bit because of the number of sources and because the concentrations are generally so low in the environment. It makes it very difficult then to pinpoint a source.
Okay. So in your direct testimony, you talk about oil and gas companies have used PFAS as a friction reducers. Now, my question is, are there no better substitutes for that?
Well, they use the common compounds that are used as polyacrylamide is what's typically used. It's a different compound altogether. It's not a PFAS. I don't know the reason that particular PTFE and FPEG were used, but based on the description in Frac Focus, that's where that information came from. It was a friction reducer.
Okay. So if OCC is to ban the use of PFAS, what impact, in your opinion, is going to be on NIMOGA?
I can't speak for NIMOGA, but I mean, they are in favor of this ban of the, again, based on our definition, and which is very similar to OCD's. And as we talked before, all groups, the definitions are actually very similar. I don't know the impact on NIMOGA, but I don't think it would have any impact at all, to be honest. But I can't speak fully to that, Commissioner.
Now, with regards to the additive issues, and then also the intentionally added, what about if, let's say, NIMOGA, or let's say oil and gas industry, is to know more about the composition of the source of water that they are using for their downhole operations? Would that be a big ask?
I can't speak to, I mean, again, there'd be some sampling involved, fair amount of sampling to get representative numbers. PFAS analyses are typically, I think, $300 or $400 a sample or so is what typically for us. So it's not a huge ask, but in terms of the getting the data density to get a good understanding of your source water would require a fair amount of sampling.
So based on your analysis of Frac Focus, do you believe that is enough, with regards to disclosures?
I can't, again, I'm not a trade secret expert on that, Commissioner. So in terms of, are you suggesting, what's my opinion on whether that should be full disclosure or not? Is that?
No. So right now, what is actually disclosed, from based on your expertise and your review of that, is it accurate? Or no, is it sufficient? Let me put it that way.
I mean, there are a fair amount of ingredients that are provided in disclosure. So if you looked at one of the exhibits, there's a fair amount of, I don't have a disclosure in my exhibits, but I believe some of the other experts did. So a lot of ingredients are provided in Frac Focus. Of course, there are trade secrets as well.
So you make mention of some PFAS that might have been used in oil and gas operations, that more or less you got to know about that through Frac Focus.
Are you referring to the single chain, single fully fluorinated, or are you?
Yeah, the PTFE.
So PTFE and FPEG from Frac Focus. So the actual disclosure was how we were able to identify that.
So specifically on page 3, item number 7 of your direct testimony. Now I want to ask, were these chemicals that you found in Frac Focus, were they marked confidential, or it was just directly there that you can see?
It was directly there.
Okay. I think we've talked about this, but just want to be sure that do you have any evidence or any knowledge that the utilization of the 2.2%, or let's say the 0.38% of the over 9,000 Frac Focus records contributed to any USDW contamination?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay. Now, since more or less you work a lot with oil and gas companies, let me ask this. Is there any research that is going on that you are aware of within NIMOGA, or let's say in the oil and gas industry, to fully understand the chemicals that are actually utilized in operations and downhole operations?
I'm not aware of that.
If not, then why should the commission not take extreme action to ban, or let's say to more or less protect the public?
I believe that no matter what your definition you choose, Commissioner, that you are protecting the public.
Still
This is a
banning.
huge list of PFAS that are in those. Again, and I'm just to make clear, we are excluding the single fully fluorinated PFAS because those are not consistent with what's the EPA TSCA definition, as well as those would not be the types of compounds you would expect to see in hydraulic fracturing.
Are you familiar with the oil and gas industry voluntarily, suspending utilizing any chemical?
I don't, I'm not aware of that.
So then I'll follow up and say that based on your knowledge, is it that the oil and gas industry more or less widely depends on the government to act before phasing out any toxic chemical?
I can't speak to that either,
Okay.
Commissioner.
So based on your testimony, I thought we were going to talk about, I have been asked by NIMOGA to address WEC's amendments 19.15.2, 19.15.7 goes on and on. But so I just want to be clear on that.
My involvement was to help with the terminology on those sections. So I did not write those sections. I helped with the terminology, certain terminology. And I made that clear in my direct testimony that these were the certain sections that I recommended changes were made.
Okay, let's talk about the definition.
Yes.
So based on the hearing, as of now, OCD is considering excluding OTM 45 and OTM 50 from the methods.
Correct.
Do you have any comment on that?
That is the correct thing to do. That's right.
Why is it? Why
Those
is
are air
that?
methods. So the focus here is on water.
Okay. I'm going to pause here. Thank you.
Madam Hearing Officer,
Yes.
if I may, I don't mean to get out of my lane as counsel. I did discuss this with the chair before he left, but there was one question that he thought would be pertinent to ask, if I may, on his behalf.
Yes, actually, I just checked with Ms. Apodaca via text, and she said the chair is on the platform. She's about to unmute him. Shall we
Okay.
let him ask the question,
Thank you.
Mr. Chair? Mr. Chair?
He's muted.
Madam Hearing Officer, my apologies. Traffic's a
Hello.
little crazy, so my apologies for that. Mr. Rubin was asking, and we were talking about aquifers, and we're talking a lot about shallow aquifers, but we were wondering, at one point there was conversation about the formations, and do we know what's going on downhole? As far as, I believe the quote was a black hole or something to that extent. I apologize, I don't have my notes in front of me. So there's a lot of focus on shallower aquifers. Does the doctor have any concerns about, or any comments that he'd like to tell us about what's happening with deeper freshwater aquifers?
And if I could add that, I believe the testimony of Dr. Spears just said aquifers. And in Dr. Richardson's rebuttal, he said he disagreed with that, and he said shallow aquifers. So I wanted to make sure it wasn't a sleight of hand, and that you meant to disagree with not just shallow, but let's say artesian aquifers.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm not disagreeing with aquifers. I from an environmental standpoint, and again, I only can speak from being an environmental engineer, is that we focus mainly on the shallow drinking water aquifers. And again, that would include, in my mind, deeper ones as well. Anything that is being used as a water source, a drinking water source.
So you're saying it's the same analysis, whether it's a shallow or an artesian aquifer with respect to potential contamination?
if you're referring to PFAS analysis, is that what you're
Yes.
saying? Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you.
Anything further, Mr. Chair?
No, that's the only question. Thank you, doctor. We appreciate your testimony.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Alrighty. Is there any reason not to excuse Dr. Richardson at this time?
No, Madam Hearing Officer, I just have one other matter after we excuse Dr. Richardson.
All right. Thank you very much for your testimony, Dr. Richardson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, hearing officer.
Ms. Mulcahy.
Thank you. I would just like to also move for admission into the record, NMOGA Exhibit A, which is the red line strikeout of Guardian's proposed rule. NMOGA Exhibit B, which is the Colorado Bill 22-1345, which is identified in the pre-hearing statement. NMOGA Exhibit C, which is Colorado Bill 22-1348, also identified in the pre-hearing statement.
Okay. Any objections to NMOGA A, B, and C? All right, they're admitted. Thank you very much. To everyone in the room and on the platform, it is 4:31, and we will take as much public comment as there is to be given. I need to do one very brief thing, though, before we accept public comment. Ms. Apodaca, would you come back to the stand, please?
Might we have a 5-minute break before we take public comment, please?
Oh, yes, we will do that too. Ms. Apodaca, did you revise the certificate of compliance in conjunction with the Commission Council?
Yes, I did.
All right. I would like to make that the substitute hearing officer Exhibit 1. Are there any, and admit it, again, to show compliance with all public notice requirements. Is there any objection to that? Okay, thank you very much. That's what we will do, and thank you, Ms. Apodaca.
Madam Hearing Officer, are we going to be able to talk about when our briefs are going to be due?
Yes, not right now. And it may in fact be a conversation that we have over email. And I'll tell you why we can't have it right now, because we don't know exactly when the transcripts will come in. And I want to make sure council has access to the transcripts before they make a commitment to post-hearing submittals.
So we'll do that via email.
All right, let's take a 5-minute break and then we will come back for public comment. To those on the platform, we've been going more than an hour and a half. Okay. Okay, we are back after a short break, and we will take whatever public comment there is to be given. I'll take some folks online first, then I'll come into the room and go back online in the event anyone else joins us. Just a few things. My name is Felicia Orth, hearing officer for this matter. Public comment can only be given once. If you have more to say than can be said in 3 minutes, or if you've already offered comment on a previous day, I would invite you to submit written public comment, which can be taken in, until this evening. And I will ask you to state, spell your name, and swear to affirm to tell the truth, and then start a stopwatch for 3 minutes. So if you're on the platform, use the hand raise function. And again, I'll take some comment online, and then I will come to the folks in the room with us. I see Mandy Sackett. Ms. Sackett, if you would unmute yourself.
Hello, my name is Mandy Sackett, and I'm a resident of Taos County.
All right. Would you spell your last name, please?
Sackett.
And do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I swear.
I will start your 3 minutes.
I'm here as a concerned resident and someone managing autoimmune health issues, which makes me especially aware of the importance of clean air, water, and land. The state's consideration of a PFAS ban in fracking is crucial, not just for individual health, but for environmental justice and our collective fight against climate change. PFAS, or forever chemicals, are linked to serious health problems, including immune system disruption and autoimmune diseases. For communities living near fracking sites, exposure to these chemicals could mean contaminated water and soil for generations. The health impacts disproportionately affect low-income and rural communities that often lack the resources to fight back or relocate. That makes this an environmental justice issue. Fracking is already a major contributor to climate change. Adding PFAS to the equation only deepens the harm, and it's unacceptable to double down on extractive practices that pollute our land and worsen greenhouse gas emissions while threatening the health of vulnerable communities, including Indigenous and rural populations. As a resident of Taos, I see the interconnectedness of our natural environment and public health. I think that clean water and healthy ecosystems in a safe climate are non-negotiable for our state's future and even mandated by our state constitution. Banning PFAS in fracking is a necessary step, but we need to go further, phasing out these practices entirely, and prioritizing renewable energies that will protect all New Mexicans. So I urge you to please pass the ban and continue working towards a just transition that will center health, environmental justice, and climate action. Our communities deserve better than the pollution and harm that fracking leaves behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sackett. We see Caitlin, I believe Caitlin Bizel.
Yes, that's right.
Hello, if you would spell your first and last name, please.
Caitlin, Caitlyn, Bizzell, Bizzell.
Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
Yes, I do.
I will start your 3 minutes.
Good evening, Madam Hearing Officer and members of the Commission. Thank you for hearing my comment today. My name is Caitlin Bizzell, and I'm a New Mexico resident currently studying environmental communications and sustainability at the University of New Mexico. As a young person involved in environmental justice, I feel compelled to comment on the risks of PFAS chemicals to the state water supply, and subsequently the risks to the health of myself, my loved ones, and my peers. PFAS chemicals are a threat to the health of all New Mexican people by contaminating our most precious resource, groundwater. The groundwater of New Mexico supplies most water used in our daily lives, meaning even a small amount of PFAS chemicals in our water can, will, and do affect a large portion of the population. New Mexico is a beautiful and resilient state, home to a diverse population of cultures and identities. Our state must be protected from oil and gas pollution to preserve the beauty of both this land and the people who have called it home for generations. These chemicals have the potential to inflict irreversible damage on all New Mexicans. The Oil Conservation Commission should take immediate action to ban PFAS from oil and gas operations. I urge you to put the health and well-being of New Mexicans first. Please protect us from unjust harm due to unregulated chemical pollution of PFAS. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bazell. Is this Kaylee Shoup? Ms. Shoup?
Yep, I'm here.
Oh, hello. Spell your first and last name, please.
Kayleyshoup.
Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
I'll start your 3 minutes.
Hello, my name is Kaylee Shoup, and I'm a community organizer with Citizens Caring for the Future in Southeast New Mexico. I live in Carlsbad, in Eddy County, where many of the produced water spills you hear of happen. The air, land, water, and health of the communities here in Southeast New Mexico have been sacrificed for years now, as we have seen the Permian oil boom take over the world. At a time when the impacts of climate change are being felt more than ever, extreme heat and drought touch our lives daily. Water is precious here, and instead of our groundwater being protected, it is being put at risk, constantly. Banning PFAS in oil and gas is one way we can buffer my community from the climate impacts and environmental impacts we are sure to see in the next 4 years and beyond, as we continue to be a living sacrifice. And we, like everyone else here, will need resources we can rely on in an uncertain future. Also, the oil field in Southeast New Mexico is filled with immigrant workers that will have more than their fair share of worries moving forward. One way we can lighten their load as a state is by ensuring that they have their health to carry them forward. This is by ensuring that they aren't exposed to unnecessary and incredibly toxic chemicals on the job. Lastly, when people are empowered with information, things change. Just this year, researchers with UC Berkeley came out with a study saying that PFAS levels in the blood of Californians were lower than the rest of the country. This is because of regulations such as the regulations you are weighing today. They save lives. They ensure that children have healthy parents, that parents don't have to mourn their own children, and that we have young people that become elders in our future. Passing a ban on PFAS in oil and gas and increasing chemical disclosure really does keep the world spinning round in its very own small way. Please understand that and act with that knowledge. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Shoup. Next, we have Crystal. Crystal?
Hi.
Hi. Would you state and spell your first and last name?
Yes, my name is Crystal Curley. Crystal, Krystal, and Curley, Curley.
Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
Yes.
I'll start your 3 minutes.
Thank you. Good evening, Oil Conservation Commissioners. My name is Crystal Curley. Kenya ani nishlan kinley chikni bushichi nakaidine dashiche ado hanagahni dashinale. I'm a Diné Navajo mother of 3 daughters. I'm also the executive director of a nonprofit named Indigenous Lifeways. It's based in McKinley County. We live in a state that celebrates access to abortion health care, but yet we have toxic extractive industries that expose our pregnant people to toxic forever chemicals like PFAS. In a 9-year period from 2013 to 2022, over 240 million pounds of trade secret chemicals were injected into wells by the oil and gas industry. The irreversible implications of these monstrous acts will forever harm the unborn and future generations. What will our future generations have left if we don't safeguard our health, our water, our bodies, and our land? How and why are we complicit in this issue? Is this what we have come as humanity? Oil and gas industry has poisoned us, poisoned our bodies, poisoned our land, and most of all, you have knowingly withheld information from the public about these toxic chemicals. By hiding behind trade secret protocol, this commission knowingly exposed New Mexico citizens and oil and gas workers to dangerous chemical compounds. Commissioners, you have an obligation to regulate, enforce, and monitor the oil and gas industry in the best interests of New Mexico taxpayers. Oil conservation commissioners must